Before we start, I'd like to let everyone know these films are from 1982, according to Internet Movie Database. Each film in the top 25 was listed as a horror film on Letterboxd, Internet Movie Database, or both. I do understand that dates listed on Internet Movie Database aren't always the wide release dates, but due to the number of films watched, it is the best way to go about it for this year and future ones. Also, please remember these are my opinions. This doesn't mean all the films in my top 25 list are the best made or necessarily historically important, although I'm sure some of them are one or both of those things. These films are just my favorites overall. When I think of the year 1982, the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of historic reoccurrence. It's often said that the 80s is a lot like the 50s, especially when it comes to media and film. A likely reason is the people who grew up in the 50s are now in positions to make remakes or similar films to the ones they enjoyed in the 50s. So it's no surprise that we see the science fiction element so strong in 1982. Of course, science fiction horror was never completely depleted from the genre, but it most certainly wasn't as popular in the 70s as it was in the 80s. There are a couple of big films from the 70s that need to be acknowledged. Of course, Alien, 1979, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978, a remake of the 1956 film by Don Siegel. These two juggernauts let the studios know that it was possible to create science fiction horror or reinvent the properties from the 40s and 50s and have an element of success. At the same time, practical effects were becoming huge, and the rock stars of the genre were no longer Dracula and Frankenstein. There were guys like Tom Savini, Rick Baker, and Rob Bottin.
But perhaps the biggest star of all in a George Romero movie is the special effects artist. Tom Savini makes sure the scares are real.
He's the workplace of Rick Baker. Rick and his co-workers are part of a minor revolution in Hollywood. They call themselves special effects makeup artists, and they manufacture the goblins, gorillas, and gore that are currently pulling in big money at box offices across the country.
This is due in part to the horror and science fiction magazines like Fangoria and Cinemagic that shared all their work in detail, as well as their immense talent. Seeing the tricks behind the trade really inspired a lot of future filmmakers and helped regional filmmakers move along. Besides the revisions like classics like The Thing from Another World into The Thing by John Carpenter, based on the novella by John Campbell, Who Goes There, and Cat People 1941, redone by Paul Schrader, there are other filmmakers where 50s nostalgia has a spot in their mind. Going back to Alien, director Ridley Scott actually made another science fiction epic in 1982, Blade Runner. Scott's film reflects a lot of classic 50s material from the science fiction world with film noir touches, and although far from a horror film, its influence on the genre will be vastly important. George Romero takes a stab at an anthology with the help of Stephen King, who is quickly becoming synonymous with household horror. Their film Creepshow is basically an EC horror comic brought to life. EC Comics had a horror run with lurid titles like Haunt of Fear and Tales from the Crypt, which lasted from 1950 until 1955. At that point, the comics were deemed inappropriate and had to be changed due to censorship, thanks to the Comics Code Authority.
Just goes to show you what happens when you get too caught up in your work.
Again, another example of historic reoccurrence would happen to the beloved horror genre in the later 80s, as the MPAA pretty much started to cut horror films to ribbons. And don't even get me started on the censorship from the British film boards and their whole video nasty fiasco that reached its height in 1982. Just because science fiction and special effects were taking over, it doesn't mean that the other subgenres just completely disappeared overnight. The slasher genre still had a strong showing this year, not quite like it did in 1981. The paranormal subgenre got a huge injection with Spielberg-produced Poltergeist, directed by horror legend Tobe Hooper, which was cut from the same cloth as E.T., the film Spielberg directed in 1982, again, another science fiction film. A couple more films would be accused of lifting from Poltergeist, but were in production around the same time, and were just a victim of release dates, such as One Dark Night and The Entity. Both films attempt to bring a sense of pseudoscience to their subjects, similar to that of Poltergeist. The Entity was even based on a true story. Stop motion wasn't invented in the 50s, but it was used heavily by the likes of Ray Harryhausen and others, although budget constraints might be the reason for the use of it in 1982. I can't help but think there wasn't an affinity for it when the likes of Larry Cohen, John Carpenter, and Frank Henenlotter used it for their films, the latter his feature-length debut. Another technique or gimmick used heavily in the 50s was 3D, a fun and exciting way to see films. Of course, in the early 50s, not everything in 3D was horror or sci-fi, but it came from space, and House of Wax from '53 sure fit the bill. There was only a matter of time before independents like Charles Band, decided to take a page out of yesteryear. His science fiction horror film Parasite in 3D ended up being a success and making over 5 times its budget. And it should be no surprise the new installment of Friday the 13th, Part 3, ended up being in 3D. Although it still packed the kills and sex we are used to from the series, it added an almost silly element to the franchise. As the series went on, it would start reflecting the directors themselves and the current tropes in the genre. Speaking of franchise slasher series, the new entry in the Halloween films, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, completely left the subgenre behind, and is very much in the style of the Quatermass films that had their start in the 50s. Nigel Neal, the writer of the original serial, actually goes uncredited as one of the writers of Halloween 3. The slasher genre in itself seemed to be in a strange area. The peak was clearly 1981, and as the 80s move along, we see some shifts. Of course, we still had some regional slashers and some stragglers. Here are some previously not mentioned: Deadly Games, Death Screams, The Dorm That Dripped Blood, The Forest, Girls' Night Out, Blood Song, Honeymoon Horror, Black Room, Alone in the Dark, Death Valley, Dark Sanity, The House on Sorority Row, Humongous, Island of Blood, Midnight, Mortuary, Trick or Treats, Unhinged, and Visiting Hours, to name a few. We also still had a few Italian and Spanish horror films coming out that might have been cut from the cloth of giallo, but were beginning to add a lot more slasher elements in the mix. A quote from Troy Howarth from his book Splintered Visions is a nice way to sum some of it up. The early 80s witnessed the death of the giallo as an especially viable commercial commodity, but it was not a genre that went quietly into the good night. Page 246. The big 3 giallo slashers, of course, being Pieces, if you want to count Spain, New York Ripper, and Tenebrae, the latter 2 directed by legends of the genre, Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento, while Pieces was directed by madman Spanish director Juan Piquer Simon, who also managed to direct the adventure film The Sea Devils in the same style as his Mystery on Monster Island from the year previous. As with all things that become oversaturated, it's only a matter of time before parodies and satire run amok, and themselves become victims of their own devices. The year previous, we had spoofs like Saturday the 14th, Full Moon High, and Student Bodies, the latter which focused on the slasher genre. This year we have a bunch. Wacko by director Graydon Clark, Pandemonium by Alfred Soule, Hysterical, Jekyll and Hyde Together Again, and National Lampoon even decided to get on the mayhem with Class Reunion. Not all of these, of course, are slasher spoofs, but you get the point. Italy also got in on the fun with Bruno Carbucci's Haunted House, and even a spoof of a giallo, no thanks, Coffee Makes Me Nervous. The previous year, Spain already turned in a wild comedy from director Jose Larraz entitled National Mummy, which was more in line with the sex comedy Monster Mash. This year we have something a little more lighthearted from Spain. Goodnight, Mr. Monster, which follows a group of kids who run into the classic monsters of the past, who are all but washed up. Paul Naschy even stars, begrudgingly, as a werewolf. Naschy spent many years keeping the classic monsters alive. It's a bit sad to see him partake in a satire of the genre he had been keeping on life support for so long. Nonetheless, it's charming and often cute, with some catchy musical numbers. Getting back to slashers, the spoofing wasn't always as apparent as some of the previously mentioned films. Slumber Party Massacre plays well as a traditional slasher and a parody, being self-aware of what made the genre entertaining, but being clever enough to poke fun at the genre as well. Also interestingly, it set the precedent that the entire series would be directed by females. With all the silliness invading the genre, it seemed that before it became too big of a joke, it had to adapt to survive by mixing of the genres and adding new elements. So it's no surprise more supernatural aspects from other genres mixed into the now played-out slasher, with the likes of Ghost Dance, the first SOB slasher Boarding House, Superstition, and The Slayer. Although by 1981 the serial killer Michael Myers is clearly not your average mad slasher, we hadn't quite been thrown heavily into the supernatural slasher world yet. Of course, the apex would be 1984 with A Nightmare on Elm Street, which shares some similarities to The Slayer by using dreams as its entry point into the horror. It's not been documented that Craven took any inspiration from the film, and most likely just an interesting predecessor of which director Wes Craven was unaware of. Keeping in line with the shift in the early 80s, Craven actually directed his own sci-fi fantasy horror film entitled Swamp Thing, based off the famous DC comic. Although the character was created in the 70s, it still reflects a bit of that 50s magic. Before we completely move past slashers, it's worth noting even action star Chuck Norris started one, Silent Rage, where Norris is a small-town sheriff and must deal with a mad killer who is injected with super serum, which makes him unstoppable. His mentally impaired deputy is played by Stephen Frust, who had just recently played a mentally deranged man-child in The Unseen, 1980. Feels part like a classic Frankenstein tale and part like a Halloween origin story. Or maybe an absurd origin story for our Joe D'Amato fans out there. Tag the Assassination Game is a pretty unique film in terms of slashers. It most certainly has many aspects from the genre, but it also has heavy inspiration from film noir and spy films. One part meet cute and one part thriller slasher, it makes for a weird mixture. Tag is the directorial debut from Nick Castle, friend and collaborator of director John Carpenter, and also the man who played the original Shape in Halloween. And just because it's worth noting, bandmate of Carpenter as well, in the Coupe de Villes. The Halloween franchise would be continued the same year, of course, without the slasher entity, but it would be the directorial debut of the third bandmate and another Carpenter collaborator, Tommy Lee Wallace. So in 1982, the Coupe de Villes, the just mentioned band, actually each directed a film. Similar to the previous 80s years, some of the biggest names of horror were still keeping busy. Romero, Hooper, Carpenter, Craven, Cohen, Argento, and Fulci all made films. While we saw the debuts of Frank Henenlotter, Basket Case, James Cameron, Piranha 2, The Spawning, co-directed by Ovidio G. Asanadas, Tom McLaughlin, One Dark Night, Jack Shoulder, Alone in the Dark, and Jeffrey Obrow and Stephen Carpenter with The Dorm That Dripped Blood. A slew of notable names in the horror and exploitation world also managed to get films off the ground. William Lustig, Vigilante, Sean Cunningham, A Stranger Is Watching, Steve Miner, Friday the 13th Part 3, Charles Band, Parasite, Gary Sherman, Vice Squad and the Mysterious 2, Alfred Soul, Pandemonium, Graydon Clark, Wacko, Larry Buchanan, Loch Ness Horror, Armin Mastroianni, The Killing Hour, Gary Graver, Trick or Treats, Bird Eye Gordon, or Mr. Big, Burned at the Stake, Don Jones, The Forest, and a couple regional filmmakers, John A. Russo, Midnight, and Don Doubler with the science fiction alien attack epic, Night Beast. As is the case with every year, a couple non-horror directors take a rare dip into the genre. Sam Fuller directed the psychological animal attacks film White Dog, Paul Schrader did a remake of Cat People, Sidney J. Fury directed The Entity, and Paul Bartel directed the horror-adjacent cannibal comedy Eating Raoul, riddled with hilarious 50s sitcom energy. Before we explore the themes, tropes, and genres as a whole, let's take a look around the globe. Canada is always good to provide a few genre films each year, either from established names like William Fruit or Paul Lynch, both making follow-ups to 1980 horror films this year. The former with his exploitation rape revenge outing Trapped, starring the likes of genre fave Henry Silva, and the latter with his nasty mutated monster offspring killer animal slasher hybrid, Humongous, which has one of the themes that seem to pop up a couple times this year: monster rape. See The Beast Within and Curse of Evil also. American director Robert Clouse directs a co-production financed by Canadian investors and Golden Harvest from Hong Kong, with his mutated killer rats film Deadly Eyes, based on a novel. A perfect director considering he had already done The Pack 1977 and the Golden Harvest film Game of Death. Any killer animal movie with the death of a baby in the first act and Scatman Crothers is worth seeing. Till Death Do Us Part is a decent TV slasher film which holds one's interest, but doesn't leave a lasting impression. The whole newlywed theme would also pop up in the tedious American slasher Honeymoon Horror from the year as well. Another film with slasher elements from the Great White North is Visiting Hours, which is part hospital slasher, part psychological serial killer film. Overall, it's pretty solid, but becomes a memorable genre film due to the performance of the ever-menacing Canadian treasure Michael Ironside. Decent performances from Lee Grant and William Shatner help as well. Murder by Phone is another strange slasher thriller hybrid, which also happens to be a co-production with the good old USA. This one stands out due to the murderer's modus operandi. Exploding phones? You have my attention. Overall, an interesting watch, and not the only horror film from 1982 that features phones on the cover in a threatening manner. See the American TV movie Hotline starring Wonder Woman herself, Linda Carter, for more telephone terror. The zero-budget, incredibly weird Big Meat Eater fits in perfect with the themes of 1982. The parody, the comedy, the 50s reoccurrence into the 80s. Big Meat Eater is most certainly one of the weirdest films of 1982. Did I also mention it's a musical, which has many similarities to the musical version of Little Shop of Horrors, which debuted a few months on stage before this movie was released? Trapped wasn't the only exploitation film Canada had to offer. Julie Darling was a West German co-production, and is an incredibly memorable and trashy horror thriller, with themes of incest. The film follows a disturbed little girl who would do anything to have her father to herself. A couple genre faves, Anthony Franciosa and Sybil Danning, add their talents. But I think the disturbing themes are what is most memorable. Last film I'd like to mention is by genre favorite Mark Lester, an American director working in Canada. Lester had been directing since the early 70s. He tackles the themes of rape revenge, vigilantism, and the carryover from the 70s out-of-control crime. This time it's affecting the youth. In the not-so-distant future, schools have become gang-ridden nightmares, and our new teacher is going to experience firsthand when he goes up against a gang of violent punks. Class of 1984 is a violent, entertaining revenger with a great cast and even better baddies. Keith Knight from My Bloody Valentine, Tim Van Patten, Lisa Langoulis from Deadly Eyes, Neil Clifford, and Stephen Engram, Fear No Evil 1981, are all tremendous as our gang of unrelenting youth. The casting of Roddy McDowall is also appreciated as a frail teacher who snaps, and Perry King does well as a new teacher who is pushed too far. The United Kingdom's output would never quite reach the heights of its Hammer days, but they were still contributing with many co-productions, one with Grease, and the strange Lovecraftian monster film Blood Tide, produced alongside Nico Mascarakis. Well, I'm fairly certain one can't make a film in Greece without his approval. The exploitation Totalitarian Society Nasty Turkey Shoot alongside Australia, and The Secret of Seagull Island, which was made alongside The Italians and was originally a miniseries from 1981 cut down to a feature this year. It's a good murder mystery with a great backdrop to it and has enough Italian tropes and genre regulars to keep you entertained. As for the full UK productions, we have some gems. First up is the supernatural Nightmares Come to Life film The Sender, which seems to be a small theme in 1982 along with The Slayer. The Haunting, The Appointment, about Edward Woodward and his family having some eerie premonitions. The bonkers alien monster horror Extra, which features some of the most mind-boggling scenes of the year. The wonderful, thought-provoking, and superbly active Brimstone and Treacle, and the satirical science run-amok end to the Lindsay Anderson's Mick Travis trilogy, Britannia Hospital. On the regional low-budget side of things, Michael J. Murphy continued his output with the demonic folk-style horror Invitation to Hell. And what would the UK be without some classic stories made for the TV? We have another rendition of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle story, The Hound of the Baskerville, and a take on the Victor Hugo classic The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which sports a solid cast including Sir Anthony Hopkins in the titular role. Ghost in the Water was most likely the last TV film released for the year, and it's a bit on the dull side, about a girl trying to figure out an old crime that is causing a haunting. The most unexpected film from the UK is the experimental work First Transmission, which runs 4 hours and was created by a group entitled The Temple of Psychic Youth, which features some known people from the underground. The film is interesting to folks who find faux snuff or other disturbing material of interest, most of which was made decades later. The sole film listed from Ireland is the folk film The Outcast, which involves magic, superstition, and a taste of how hard life was in the past. A well-shot and desolate look at superstition and the act of being shunned. For Australia, this seems to be one of the last years where they had a sizable output of horror for a while. I'm sure the 10BA tax incentives help with the 1982 output. The two standouts from this year are, of course, the previously mentioned co-production Turkey Shoot, directed by Brian Treachard Smith, who dipped his toes into many genres. Turkey Shoot is a great precursor to The Running Man with a solid cast including Steve Railsback, Roger Ward, and Olivia Hussey. It's violent, fast-paced, and undoubtedly exploitation insanity. The other film is the meticulous psychological slasher thriller Next of Kin, which has fantastic camera work and a sharp script. As for the rest, there is just a handful. Early Frost is fairly good with family drama and psychological aspects at the center of its horror. While the film Dark Room attempts some of the same themes, it falls a little short as the characters lack a bit of interest. Dark Room does feature the damaged photographer trope, of course. Crosstalk is a watchable technology run wild horror about the dangers and evils of computers, and the last is the rather drawn-out exploitation film Desolation Angels, which never quite gets exciting or appalling enough to keep anyone's interest for very long. The band SBK had a video compilation entitled Despair, with their music playing in the background. The footage set to their music is babies in jars and other atrocities. The climax is a disgusting yet obviously fake sexual assault on a decapitated head in a morgue. Again, this is only for extreme horror fans and becomes equal parts tedious and atrocious fairly quickly, although the music is decent enough. The output wasn't quite as large from the neighboring New Zealand, but their horror contribution is worth noting. The Scarecrow is a solid coming-of-age story about a pair of kids witnessing a crime taking place in a small town in 50s New Zealand. It's based on a book that was written in 1963. It's worth noting horror vet John Carradine turns in a great performance as a creepy old man who hangs out in the Undertaker's parlor, who at times looks like he may have just crawled out of one of the caskets himself. When we get to countries like France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, a lot if not most are co-productions, especially the two former. Germany had a couple independent films and shorts by Jörg Buckarett and Company with the anthology Sexgewalt and Glut Alaner, which includes Bloody Excess and A Leader's Bunker, a Frankenstein tale with Hitler of all people. It's uncertain if these shorts were released together in '82 or later. Germany also managed to have a couple standout features. Second Sight, a solid premonition horror about reincarnation and madness, directed by Dominic Graff in his first solo directing gig, and Der Fan. Der Fan is the beginning of a loose trilogy directed by Eckhard Schmidt, who is well versed in the subject of music and fandom. as he had first-hand knowledge and experience in journalism and documentaries. The casting of teen idol Desiree Nosebush was a stroke of genius and helped propel this film into cult status, a tale of obsession, murder, cannibalism, and electronic dance music. Invitation to Travel has money from 3 countries, Germany, France, Italy. The director, Peter Del Monte, is of Italian descent. The film is an odd one, which doesn't quite fit into any one genre, sort of a demented psychological road film that follows our lead character's identity crisis. Jean Roland directed his last horror film of the 80s with The Living Dead Girl, a unique zombie vampire film. It's more focused on the story of loss than horror. It ends up being one of his most emotional films while still managing a gothic atmosphere. As expected, there are tones of lesbianism, bloodshed, and long, beautiful zoom-out cinematography. Jean-Pierre Mocky directs his only horror film, L'Automne, a fantastical small-town folk horror nightmare with beautiful imagery and glorious stage set pieces. As for France's TV output, there seems to be only one. The Sorceress, based on the work of Jules Michelet. The film has a great framing story and a good period piece setting, but the TV of it all gets in the way from it packing a much-needed punch. A couple horror-adjacent films are also worth noting. Home Murders is a clever whodunit that has its lead, a police inspector and resident of an apartment complex where a murder has taken place, end up being in charge of the investigation. The rogues gallery of tenants make for an entertaining piece. We also have the prolific Claude Chabrol masterfully directing a darkly comedic serial killer film entitled The Hatter's Ghost. When we move to Spain, we still have 3 of the most prolific Spaniards working. Juan Piquer Simon has what would become his masterwork, ironically or not, in pieces. Jose Larraz continues his horror run with the demonic cult film Black Candles. Here's a paraphrase from the director about the film. The actors couldn't act, so all I could have them do was fuck. And the last wise man from Spain is, of course, Uncle Jess Franco, with 2 horror films, Mansion of the Living Dead, which features a lot of pretty women in pretty locations meeting with not-so-pretty zombie-like cult figures, reminiscent of the Blind Dead from the Osario series. Franco also managed to get a French co-production done in Oasis of the Zombies, the Eurocine classic. Often given a bad reputation as one of the worst Nazi zombie films, it's earned it, but it's not as bad as the Joel M. Reed entry into this niche subgenre. Bloody Sec is another demonic cult-like film where our satanic villains are looking to impregnate as many women with the spawn of Satan as they can. The Icebox Murders is a mostly boring serial killer double personality mystery where genre favorite Jack Taylor keeps his victims in an icebox. Written in Fog is a solid, psycho-inspired mama's boy killer film where a deranged picks off the women who work for him at his inn. Back from Beyond opens with a brutal murder of an entire family, and before long, it turns into a fairly standard ghost haunting mystery, nothing too special. We also have the musical spoof, the aforementioned Goodnight Mr. Monster, which features Dracula, Dr. Frankenstein, his monster, Quasimodo, and of course a werewolf played by Spain's own Wolfman, Paul Naschy. Sex Apocalypse is more in line with the exploitation world, but packs a mean streak worth mentioning and stars Ajita Wilson. Psychophobia is a co-production with Italy where a woman suffering the loss of her husband calls on the help of a paranormal specialist. Soon enough, the people that are causing her problems end up passing under tragic ends. A friendly old man seems to have been invaded by the husband's ghost, which complicates things. Our final heavy contributor from Europe is, of course, the land of the maestros, Italy. This year, the output wasn't quite as big as 1980, but in the same ballpark as 1981. Dario Argento directed one of his masterpieces in Tenebrae. Argento uses his film to talk directly to his naysayers, and it's brilliantly playful. The cast is amazing, from John Saxon, Daria Nicolodi, Julia Gemma, Christine Bormero, Ania Peroni, Eva Robbins, John Steiner, but the show stealer is Anthony Franciosa as Peter Neal, the Argento stand-in, who ends up being completely mad. Tenebrae ended up being the last film to make the UK Video Nasties Section 1 or 2 list. The height of the panic was 1982, and no films made after 1982 were added. Only 5 films made the 2 lists, the aforementioned Tenebrae, The Slayer, Visiting Hours, Unhinged, and The Dorm That Dripped Blood. The New York Ripper was banned outright in the UK. Lucio Fulci, for the 3rd year in a row, managed to direct more than 1 film. The New York Ripper is a giallo as well, and although it's a well-done film, it's not quite as clever as Argento's, but it certainly makes up for it with gratuitous violence and sleaze. It's often stated that this is the reason Fulci would cut back on violence in his next couple of films, is due to the kickback and the censorship issues that New York Ripper received. Fulci's other film, Manhattan Baby, is more fantastical and fits in with Egyptian horror tropes in his Gates of Hell films, sporting some of the best musical work longtime collaborator Fabio Frizzi ever did. Bruno Mattei again stayed busy with another Black Emanuelle film starring Laura Gemser. This time around she goes undercover in a woman's prison, and violence in a woman's prison ensues. Mattei also had his name on Nero and Popea, an Orgy of Power, which was basically just a way to make another Caligula movie rifled with the typical taboo-breaking themes. Both of these were co-productions with France. Scorpion with Two Tails is one of the oddest films from Italy this year, listed as a co-production with France. This was at one point a made-for-TV miniseries, which was cut down to film length. Dardano Sacchetti and Ernesto Gastaldi are both listed as being responsible for the story. Two of the most prolific Italian horror writers having their name on this, as well as a great director in Sergio Martino and a solid cast attached, make one wonder how good it could have been. The film we do get is a bit uneven, mixing supernatural elements with crime and giallo tropes. The deleted scenes floating around would have brought some nice additions to the story, but as it stands, the film is just a decent curio. Giulio Questi continued his foray into television, following up his 1981 The Devil's Game TV film with Vampirismus, which is a creepy and subtle vampire tale. It would be quite shocking if Joe D'Amato didn't get at least one horror exploitation film directed in 1982. This time around, he made a follow-up to Caligula, entitled Caligula, The Untold Story. David Brandon stars as our Roman monster. He does a decent job, but if you aren't looking to watch a lot of debauchery, there are better ways to waste your time. Don't Look in the Attic is a gothic tale about curses, inheritance, hereditary horrors, and like all good gothic tales, incest. Its bad reputation and poor releases tend to give this one a poor name, even before many people see it. Seek it out for yourself. The previously mentioned parodies No Thanks, Coffee Makes Me Nervous, and Haunted House are both worth a look if you can get past some of the cultural comedy references. Alberto Del Martino directed a strange co-production with Germany and the USA starring wild man actor Michael Moriarty, playing dual roles. While someone like Larry Cohen used him to perfection in this year's Q, the Winged Serpent, it doesn't appear that Alberto Del Martino had such luck. Overall, the film is messy, but worth watching for a completely off-the-wall bonkers performance from Moriarty, as well as a murder in the park involving genre favorite Cameron Mitchell. God bless Cameron Mitchell. Panic is a decent mutated dangerous man story involving David Warbeck, another co-production with Spain. It's not exactly the most memorable, it's not entirely awful either, for fans of the Beck and Janet Argan. Ennio G. Castellari followed up his 1981 film The Last Shark with another cash-in, the 1990 The Bronx Warriors. With the popularity of films like The Warriors, Escape from New York, and Road Warrior, it was only a matter of time before Italy jumped on the bandwagon and made some entertaining exploitation action flicks. 1990, The Bronx Warriors has plenty of violence and genre faves to be of interest to horror fans. Fred Williamson, Christopher Conley, also in this year's Manhattan Baby, George Eastman, and Vic Morrow in his chewing the scenery best.
I know. And I love it. I love it.
Invaders of the Lost Gold is a rare co-production with Hong Kong. The cast is too good for how bad this one ended up. Stuart Whitman, Edmund Purdom, Laura Gemser, Woody Strode, and Harold Sakata most likely drank their paycheck up. I know I would have. Italy also turned in a few hardcore films ranging in quality, the best being Satan's Baby Doll by Mario Bianchi. It was made into a couple versions, a hardcore and softcore. Both were decent enough. The horror aspects are gothic and involve possession. Funny Frankenstein, also directed by Bianchi, follows the antics of a couple journalists who get caught up in some sescapades at a castle. It's silly, yet funny enough at times, and much more different than his other film. Last is The Babysitter, an awful horror porn with a rapist small person. There are many versions floating around of this one, but I can't imagine any of them are any good. We don't have much output from Mexico this year, but we do have a co-production with the United States in Amityville 2, The Possession, directed by Italian crime and political film director Talamano Delamanti, and written by Tommy Lee Wallace. This one stands out as being one of a handful of sequels this year, but most likely the only prequel. It's based on the real-life murders that took place before the sensational and skeptical film The Amityville Horror, which also claims to be a true story. Possession brings together Burt Young, Rotunda Alda, and Diane Franklin as the family that meets their tragic end in Amityville, New York on that night. In this film's version, it's due to possession. The year previous, Brazil had a slew of films that mixed in extreme content, including sexual assault and grounded violent criminal acts. The reincarnation of sex takes the more haunting approach. It doesn't skip out on the sleaze and nudity, but it's more in line with traditional horror. Ivan Cardoso, one of the most prolific directors from Brazil, turns an absolutely bonkers mummy film filled with nudity experiments and a mummy running amok. It's silly and weird. Wild Sex of the Children of the Night feels like it might be partly inspired by The Warriors and the Road Warrior, but it's more focused on exploitation than anything. A bunch of scantily clad post-apocalyptic looking gang members fight, kill, and sexually assault each other occasionally. More in line with exploitation, of course, is the woman in prison picture, The Amazon Jail, where women fight for survival before they are sold to sex slavery. When we shift our focus to Colombia, we have a hidden gem in Pure Blood, Pura Sangre. A wealthy old dying man requires young blood, so a member of his family decides to acquire it illegally. Pura Sangre is parts modern-day vampire film and serial killer film. Yaro Pinilla directs 27 Hours with the Dead, an insurance scheme horror film with your standard double crossings. The story would be perfect for a 30-minute episode of an anthology horror, but not for feature length as it stands. House of Seven Tombs is from Argentina, but feels a bit more in line with the Italian or Spanish films from the time. A little too inept to be great, but it managed to create a solid atmosphere and has a couple things worth noting, including a mentally handicapped girl who feeds pigs as well as rolls around in the same mud with them. Before we head to Asia, there are a handful of countries that contributed with 1 or 2 films, mostly from around Europe, with the exception of South Africa. Well-respected director George Hertz directed Ferret Vampire from Czechoslovakia, which follows a doctor as they attempt to prove a car manufacturer is creating cars that run on human blood. In the same sort of vein as Virus and Writhing Tongue from 1980, we follow an outbreak of smallpox based on the true incident in the film Vira Ola Vera. This Yugoslavian film is well done and bleak. Speaking of true story horrors, Anna I Vampire is a Polish film that follows the murders, tracking, and the arrest of the vampire from Zagelby. It's dark, atmospheric, and just as bleak as the previous film mentioned. For something a bit different in terms of a reality, we have Queen of Spades, the USSR TV film that follows a man who becomes obsessed with the tale of cards and winning. It's a subtle, haunting film and worth the investment. The Pencil Murders is an oddball Belgian giallo-style film about a police detective trying to solve a series of murders. The killer, of course, uses you guessed it, a pencil to kill their victims by placing it violently in one's nose. Our detective struggles with his marriage falling apart as the killings seem to be getting closer to home. Our last European film worth noting is from Denmark, The Parallel Corpse. It follows a criminal who decides to hide the body of a murdered young girl in a mortician's office. The mortician, being a criminal himself, decides to blackmail our killer. A good cat and mouse story that literally blows up in the end. A little bit out of place here is a pair of South African horror films. Claws, which pits a young child left alone to fend for himself against a large predator of sorts. It's a tedious and rather dull TV film. And The Demon, which seems to change its release date here and there, sometimes listed as 1979, while other times listed as 1982. It's a bizarre demonic slasher where Cameron Mitchell is pitted up against a supernatural foe. It's unfortunate at the halfway mark the movie decides to shift focus and loses its momentum. In the 80s, Hong Kong was still going strong with their horror output. Shaw Brothers had started their horror films in the late 50s and went until the mid-80s. A lot of their horror films lean into thriller, exploitation, martial arts, or fantasy, but a good chunk of them managed to be some of the wildest and most entertaining horrors on the screen. For the adventurous horror film fan, Hong Kong is one of the last great frontiers of horror. I would think that Human Lanterns would probably be the standout to most from the Shaw catalog this year. A period piece slasher mystery packed with martial arts and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre inspired skin play. Hell Has No Boundary is an excellent possession film where our possessed kill everyone that causes her any issue, and much more. Includes a wicked elevator death and great over-stylized lighting with a nice touch of police action. Kawa Chi-hung was a very prolific horror director for Shaw. Already having directed Corpse Mania, Bewitched, and Bamboo House of Dolls, he would direct this year's Curse of Evil, before he would manage to direct The Boxer's Omen the following year. Curse of Evil follows a somewhat convoluted story of generational familial murder, but it's done in such a way that only Shaw could do, involving slug-raping monsters, cannibalistic frog creatures, and a slew of other insane antics. Kawa Chi-hung also finished out his loose trilogy with Hex After Hex, where a stuntman is tricked to marrying a man's ghost daughter. Overall, it's pretty silly, with a lot of Star Wars references, but we're checking out, and an improvement on the second in the series. The Fake Ghost Snatchers follows a pair of mediums who communicate with ghosts for profit. Plenty of martial arts action and good ghost gags, with the talents of Shou Ho and Alexander Fu Shang. Kid from Kwang Tung is listed as a horror film, but really only has a scene or two involving hand-inked paper spells, and it's more of a standard martial arts film. While Legendary Weapons of China is more of a martial arts film with fantasy elements in the fighting styles, also listed sometimes as horror. Golden Harvest had a solid quartet of films. The Dead and Deadly, starring Sammo Hung, makes for a good follow-up to his film Encounters of the Spooky Kind from 1980. It's not quite as groundbreaking, but it's still packed with some great comedy bits, and it has a fair share of spooky moments. Ghosts and hauntings are often used in comedy, especially when it comes to Hong Kong films. Usually the plot involves scams and tricks to make money. At times we have body hopping, tragedy of errors, misplaced spells, and a slew of other crazy antics. The Dead and Deadly fits this bill, but shines out many of its contemporaries due to the star Sammo Hung, who faces off against a trio of little creatures at the end. To Hell with the Devil stands as the only horror film action director John Woo ever did. An absolute ADHD comedy nightmare. The movie jumps around to all sorts of wild scenarios and ends in a live-action video game duel to the death. The Miracle Fighters is part of a loose series of horror films that are more in line with fantasy and martial arts than horror. Entertaining and well worth a look for fans of wuxia action. The Final Golden Harvest is the co-production Killer Rats film mentioned earlier, Deadly Eyes. While we are on the subject of killer animals, we should mention Centipede Horror, as a gross-out flick about evil spells, in line with something like The Devil and Bewitched, both from 1981, but not quite as good as either. Features puked-up centipedes and all the fixins we would expect. The other animal attacks film here is certainly a more memorable and more irreprehensible film. Calamity of Snakes is a Taiwan co-production which features some of the most insane snake attacks ever filmed. It's unfortunate that the film includes countless animal cruelty scenes. It still makes for a jaw-dropping, entertaining experience. Till Death Do We Scare is a marriage horror comedy. When a woman loses 3 husbands in quick succession, they all decide to follow her around and haunt and protect her, trying to find the perfect husband for her. The end set piece is a wild ghost party with fun gags and huge crazy effects. The oddest credit on this film is that Tom Savini himself does some of the special effects. Long Kar Wing, who did the fake Ghost Snatchers, also directed this one, fittingly. Ghost Nursing follows the story of a woman in Taiwan who adopts a ghost kid, which was a real-life phenomenon that took place. It's supposed to turn her bad luck around after she suffered. At first, it's just some simple jealousy, but before long, our ghost kid is on a murderous rampage and ends up possessing an unknowing person. This leads to a final confrontation with the shaman, which is common for Asian possession and haunting films. He Lives by Night is a comedy horror thriller where a mad killer is cross-dressing and strangling women of the night with stockings. Enter Kent Chang, who in an attempt to catch our killer falls in love with the lead he is trying to protect. Made up of ultra-silly comedy and wet, glistering, gritty Hong Kong night shots. Expensive Taste is a rape revenge flick with a handful of nasty little touches that make it stand out. Feeling more in line with the 90s Cat 3 film than an 80s Hong Kong horror, the villain using cacti is a disturbing touch. Kung Fu from Beyond the Grave, not to be confused with 1981's Kung Fu Zombie, takes place in a similar celebration to that of Day of the Dead, where the veil of life and death is at its thinnest. A son pledges to avenge his father's wrongful death. Wackiness ensues. By the end of the movie, we have a squad of ghosts fighting Dracula, who appears out of nowhere. It's all as nonsense as it sounds. Behind the Storm is a good little gothic slasher about a family of would-be inheritors who start getting picked off one by one, featuring some decent kills and performances by Daniel Lee and Melvin Wong. Mariana is a co-production with the Philippines, about 2 tribes after the same woman. After she escapes, she returns to her homeland only for an insane final conflict to ensue. A decent enough film with a chaotic ending. Ninja the Violent Sorcerer is a Godfrey Ho edited film, taken from a Taiwan project called The Stunning Gambling. The Stunning Gambling seems to be a mostly boring gambling drama, while the new version incorporates hopping vampires and martial arts. The end result is a Frankenstein-together mess. Yao Gai Chen directed 2 movies this year. The first is Girl with a Gun, which is an unauthorized remake of Abel Ferrara's Miss 45 from 1981. The plot is fairly similar, but it does pull its punches a bit more. Still an interesting interpretation to see. Funny enough, Godfrey Ho actually used scenes from Girl with a Gun to make Fury in Red 1988. Chen also directed Devil Returns, about a rape victim tormented by her attacker from beyond the grave. She carries our rapist babies to terms and it only gets worse for her after that. It lifts scores freely for Maniac and others. Jen Che Chong, to follow up The Devil 1981, has a pair of flicks. The Witch with the Flying Head, which has some iconic imagery. With a title like that, how could it not? A woman is cursed after she refuses marriage and becomes a flying head monster murderer by night. It never quite finds its focus enough to be as good as some of its equally crazy contemporaries. Chong's other film, The Evil Girl, also follows a girl with a curse who wakes at night and murders. This time, she's not a flying head, she drinks blood. A little bit easier to follow than his other film of this year. You got it. Of course, it ends in a magic battle. Wolf Devil Woman is a revenger that follows a woman out to avenge her parents. It's up to a ragtag group of people to take out an evil force. A rather forgettable film. Breakout from Oppression, aka Exposed to Danger, has a couple versions floating around. The original 1982 version is as follows. A wrongfully accused woman who gets paroled ends up working in a small town at a newspaper. A young girl becomes obsessed with our parolee's boyfriend. Well acted, with an occasional murder. If you listen carefully, you can hear Pino Donaggio's music from The Howling. The longer the film goes on, the more tedious and less horror it becomes. Golden Buddha Against the Snake Phantom is a co-production with Thailand, more of a fantasy film than horror. Animal cruelty is abundant, people change from humans to snakes several times, and we even have some kaiju action. Overall, it doesn't translate very good to be of much interest. Indonesian director Siswara Gunamaputra managed to direct a couple films this year. First up is the start of his Snake Woman trilogy with The Snake Queen, starring of course Indonesian staples Susanna and Barry Prima. The Snake Queen is an evil goddess who gives power to those who make sacrifices of family members. An evil patriarch is looking towards his soon-to-be son-in-law for the next offering. Decent enough flick, but I think by the time we get to the third film, The Hungry Snake Queen, made in '86, the effects and insanity are amped up, and it's more to my liking. Pucher's other film, Sang Karang, also starring Susanna, is a bit more of a fantasy origin story of a myth. A forbidden love leads to banishment and deformity. Our young hero eventually is taught some magical powers and falls in love with his thought-to-be-dead mother unknowingly. Sang Karang is a bit more boundary-pushing in terms of sexuality than some of the other Indonesian films of the time. Angry Volcano is in the same vein as the previous film, about a banished man learning magical powers to return and kill his enemies. A little bit of gore and a decent showdown. Miracle Baby Falls is a story of a child who is cursed at birth and manages to kill anyone who crosses him. There are plenty of other subgenres, including a race for mayor and a diamond discovery that lead to our curse in the first place. Special Silencers is the closest Indonesia gets to a melt film, worth watching for insane special effects. Karma Punishment follows a woman who gets an unwanted pregnancy by a man who has made a pact with a shaman for power. The biggest note that Karma Punishment has is a wild head generation. Revenge of Nina Tawuk is a revenge story, a little bit in the vein of Japan's myth Yusuya Kadan, where our deformed mother plans for revenge. In the Heat of the Night follows an unhappily married man who starts an affair. Before he can leave his wife, he dies. His will states that his unborn baby that his mistress is carrying receives more than his current wife. The wife seeks help from a butler who has evil plans of his own. Jungle Virgin Force is an exploitation jungle adventure film. If you want treasure hunters, anthropologists, and spells, check it out. It's as if Primitives 1980 and Massacre in Dinosaur Valley 1985 had a child and never knew which one it wanted to take after. The Philippines only had a couple of horror films this year. First is The House in the Woods, a well-done ghost love triangle. It's an interesting look into some of the past atrocities that happened in the Philippines. Stone Boy is more in line with fantasy than any other genre. Similar to some of those Indonesian films of the time, our young hero in the film encounters an assortment of strange beasts and other villains, making it a little bit more horror-adjacent. Raw Force is a co-production with the United States, a complete and utterly insane mishmash. Part adventure film, part zombie film, and part white slave or exploitation film. Cameron Mitchell lends his talents to the project, and a couple icons remain in fairly hidden or small parts. Kamel Keaton, Jules Shepard, and Vic Diaz, who may be in every Philippines-produced movie ever. There were only a couple from South Korea this year. Kim Kai-young made a remake of his 1960 and 1971 film, finishing out the trilogy with A Woman of Fire, 1982. It's a brilliant mystery family drama nightmare about infidelity and obsession. It has a bit of similarities to the 1981 film Suddenly in the Dark. Dracula Rises from Coffin is a fairly classic take on Dracula. It fits more in line with something like Hammer's Dracula in 1972 AD than anything else. Make sure to stick around for Dracula in the Disco. The final contributor is Japan. By the late 80s, Japan had a slew of direct-to-video films to fill the video store boom. But before it had a big boom, most of Japan's horror films fit in line with thriller mysteries, classic ghost stories, and more heavily erotic or exploitation films. Most of these put out by the Nakatsu Corporation. The erotic line would start in the early 70s and disappear for a long time by the late 80s. Japan managed to put out a few made-for-TV movies. Obayashi's Cute Devil stands out, not just among the TV films, but perhaps the entire country, in the vein of other killer kids films like The Bad Seed and Carrie, but with a possible twist. The Living Kohiji, directed by Nobu Nakagawa, is a classic love triangle revenge tale. At times it dips into the more supernatural. It feels more in line with 50s and 60s Japanese output. Lullaby of Death is the last directed film from Yasuzu Masamura. It is a beautifully structured murder mystery with plenty of psychologically damaged characters and tragic ends. Highly recommended. Pool Without Water is more of a dark character study. It follows a disturbed young man who begins to sexually assault women after chloroforming them. At one point, he begins a strange relationship with one of his victims, which make for some ugly circumstances. Cult director Koji Wakamatsu isn't new to exploring darker and damaged characters, and with his touch, Pool Without Water feels much more than a dirty exploitation film some may see it as. Before we move into the more horror-adjacent categories, I'd like to mention two TV films. A Ghost Love Story of Japan, which follows the same source material as The Bride from Hades, or Peony Lantern. It's solid enough, but not quite as good as the '68 film. And also The Vampire Inspector, a nice period piece revenge tale. It's a nice mix of genres, times, and from a country you don't often see. The House Where Evil Dwells is a strange haunting film by Brit Kevin Connor. A decent cast and a couple of memorable scenes including evil crabs make this one a bit more noteworthy. Sogo Ishii had a follow-up to Crazy Thunder Road with Burst City, which involves bikers, riots, musical bands, and other agents of chaos. Similar to Burst City, Harlem Valentine's Day, Blood is Sex, is also set in the near future. Basically, it's a one crazy night film following a violent man trying to find his lost love. The city looks dangerous and unfriendly, and everyone he comes in contact with, it ends in violence. Hunting Schedule Corpse Assault is aptly titled. The plot is about a trio of degenerate young men who carry out crime, including assault. It's more in line with the Nakatsu erotic films, but it feels a bit more in the style of guerrilla filmmaking. with sexual assaults taking place on trains and in open fields. It makes for something a little bit less polished and, dare I say, dangerous. As for the actual Nakatsu erotic film line, we have 9 films ranging in quality from good to mediocre. The standouts are Right Rose Campus, which may be one of the most insanely offensive films from the line, following a group of criminals who board a teen school bus and begin raping them. The dark, nasty comedy hits a high when the ugly girls are asked to exit the bus. When they are finally picked up by a pair of truckers, who also happen to be perverts, they complain to them that they were called ugly, not that their lives were threatened and their friends raped, that they were ugly. Slave Contract is a nasty tale about a rich, sophisticated couple who receive a slave girl as a present. At first, this puts a divide amongst them, but soon enough, feelings are awakened and the ideals are shifted. By the end, a sex slave auction takes place right in their living room, much more thought-provoking than one would think. The Girl and the Wooden Horse Torture is a lurid story about a wrongfully condemned teacher and a former student crossing paths again. They end up living out a disturbed sexual fantasy of hers. Nakatsu regular Izumi Shima turns in a great performance in Black Hair, Velvet Soul as a woman pushed into prostitution due to no fault of her own. A subdued, real, and strong performance are at the heart of this film. Shima also stars in Blue Woman, where an adulterous wife is forced into sexual torture from her in-laws and closeted husband. Blue Woman has a disturbing, dark ending. A pair from the Loose Female Teacher series was also released in 1982 as well. Female Teacher Hunting. A student makes up a false rape claim, and another is banished from school. Our banished student's teacher runs into him while having an affair at a seaside town, and the two crossing paths once again will only lead to tragedy. Female Teacher in front of the students follows the story of our teacher standing up for a student and ends up getting sexually assaulted in the shower for her troubles. Her rapist leaves a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, which leads our victim into trying to find out who her assailant was. Each suspect she encounters ends in a nasty assault. Akin, Nakatsu plays with the disturbing idea of consent and rape fantasy. Chu Se-son, who directed a couple of the Angel Gut films, directs a fairly repetitive film with Demon's Room, a black male rape fantasy. The ending stands out, but the rest becomes a tad tedious. Nurse Diary Beast Afternoon is part horror, part erotic, and part mad scientist film. The ideals on paper are interesting with sex dreams and stormy nights, but the end result is a little sloppy and cheap for a Nakatsu film. Tackling the United States as a whole would be a bit too much, so we will break it down further into subgenres, occasionally mentioning some of the films from other countries as well. So if this gets a bit repetitive, I do apologize. I just feel that every film needs to have a couple mentions or a mention to get across the wide variety of films that were released in 1982. As we started in the beginning with slashers, it's only right that we get back to them sooner than later. Again, I bring up the biggest slasher film of the year and the biggest slasher franchise of the 80s. Born in 1980 and having a film for nearly every year of the decade, Friday the 13th Part 3 at one point was touted to be the last one from the producers and creators of the series, but obviously that changed with Part 4 and even changed when The New Beginning came out. There was a noticeable shift in production values filming in California over Jersey, and with the incorporation of 3D, it created a lot of headaches for the cast and crew. Although some of the same core people were still in charge, it did seem like it was getting away from the little bit of regional charm the first two films had. But by the time the credits roll, it still felt very much like a Friday film, with plenty of kills, nudity, and an epic chase sequence to cap it off. It's worth noting that Fangoria is featured in the film. A shout out to Tom Savini and his infamous arrow kill from Part 1. It's a bit of a meta-style humor as our soon-to-be victim is glancing the pages of America's favorite lurid magazine, waiting for the return of her boyfriend, and is dispatched in a similar fashion. New World Pictures usually produced and distributed exploitation, science fiction, and an occasional foreign art film. They weren't in a habit at the time of distributing slasher films, albeit they did do Tag and Murder by Phone this year as well. But with something like Slumber Party Massacre, it fit well within the company. The director, Amy Holden Jones, approached Roger Corman to direct a feature film so she could move away from editing. After proving herself with a short concept film, she was greenlit to do the feature. Slumber Party Massacre hits the ground running and gets its simple story set up. The plot is essentially Halloween. A group of pretty young girls are stalked by an unknown madman. There is a sense of self-awareness that bleeds on the screen, but the film is played straight enough to work both as a critique of the genre and as a genuine slasher. Our killer uses a giant power drill that is clearly a phallic symbol, and every time he enters the frame he is followed by bombastic, evil music. The Slumber Party Massacre did so well we would see dozens of films in its style, including 2 sequels and a remake, all directed by women, and a bunch of slasher-style nudies directed by Jim Wynorski. The House on Sorority Row is another classic slasher with a group of young girls dealing with a mysterious killer who's out for revenge on a prank gone wrong. A bit of a precursor to things like I Know What You Did Last Summer, The House on Sorority Row managed to create a good group of characters with differentiating personalities that stand out enough to make it memorable. The college backdrop wasn't new to the slasher subgenre. 1981 used it thoroughly. Final Exam, Night School, The Prowler, Bloody Moon, and Strange Behavior. But having the main set pieces be set almost entirely in the sorority house makes this one a tad different. We are also reminded of previous slasher films like The Unseen, Hell Night, and other films where our killer may be lurking, hidden inside your residence. The House on Sorority Row also has a slasher trope of the disfigured or unwanted child, similar to Humongous, Friday the 13th, Hell Night, and The Unseen. Before we move past the college slaughtering grounds, we should mention, of course, the wild Spanish giallo slasher Pieces, where our killer is building the perfect victim, similar to a puzzle. The Dorm That Dripped Blood is about a small group of students getting ready to pack everything up before their dorm is demolished. Of course, someone has a different idea of what needs to be disposed of. Clearly low budget, but the kills were effective enough to land The Dorm That Dripped Blood on the Video Nasties list. Unfortunately, for years, the film only had releases that were synonymous with trash. Worth noting is that the film is actually a Christmas film, as well as the debut of actress Daphne Nuziga, who would go to do another slasher just a couple years later in The Initiation. Slasher and horror films are a great fertile ground to find new upcoming talent as well as cast down on their luck vets, which is something that our next college slasher ended up doing. Girls' Night Out has appearances by vets Hal Holbrook and Rutanya Alda, and on the flip side had Julie Montgomery and Friday the 13th Part 2 alumni Lauren Marie Taylor. Girls' Night Out takes place during a college's yearly scavenger hunt, which is a great way to get our characters alone so they can be periodically picked off throughout the night. Girls' Night Out sports the classic trope of a possible escaped mental patient, but this time around it's only used as a red herring. A huge chunk of the victims end up being involved with the basketball team, as our killer steals the mascot outfit, a giant bear, which our killer adds some homemade Krueger-style claws to. There is something about basketball stars and slashers, as our killers seem to have a taste for them in Slumber Party Massacre as well. The games and murders in Tag the Assassination Game also take place in the college halls. Not exactly a slasher like previously mentioned, it does share a lot of DNA, especially with Girls' Night Out. Deadly Games opens up with a well-crafted murder, and the victim's sister comes back to town. We are quickly introduced to the townsfolk. We spend time watching our cast play football, gossip, and eventually we watch them die. DP and director Gary Graver followed up his underrated 1980 psychological horror film, The Attic, with a pretty low-rent slasher in the vein of Halloween, about a young babysitter stuck with an annoying young prankster. Our prankster is played by the director's son and becomes such a little prick, it becomes almost a comical affair. The whole child prank storyline seems to be a little bit of an extension to 1981's Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. Trick or Treats manages to support a solid cast amongst its tedious pacing. Peter Jason, David Carradine, Carrie Snodgrass, Steve Railsback, and even Paul Bartel have a role. It's almost as if they decided to remake Halloween without the suspense. I'm sure the beer budget on Trick or Treats was hefty, as it was in our next film. Dark Sanity is a psychological slasher in the style of the House of Psychotic Women subgenre. Although Ray stumbles his way through his poorly edited dialogue, very forgettable besides the fact that known alcoholic actor Ray stops our lead from drinking a beer.
I know I seem like a weirdo. Nobody knows that better than me, but just give me 2 minutes. That's all I ask.
Oftentimes, second sight or clairvoyance are at the center of our horror, and in particular, slasher films. Oddly, both of those nouns are titles of horror films this year. Armin Mastroianni follows up his 1980 slasher film, He Knows You're Alone, with his sleazy New York giallo slasher, The Killing Hour, or its more appropriate title, The Clairvoyant. Our antagonist draws pictures of the murders before they happen. As popular as New York City sleaze is in horror of the 70s and 80s, it's surprising that this little shocker doesn't get nearly any love. Perry King is tremendous as a TV talk show host who has a few skeletons in his closet. Much different than his role in this year's class of 1984 as Mr. Norris. Blood Song and Blood Link both use the Blood moniker in their title, of course, but also they share the Psychic Vision subplot where two characters are bonded, this time amply by blood. Our lead in Blood Song is stalked by an escaped mental patient she once received a blood transfusion from. This somehow leads to her being able to see our killer's exploits. Blood Song stands out mostly due to the fact that singer Frankie Avalon plays our mad slasher, but my favorite bits are watching Richard Jekyll in a rare unsavory performance, far from his days in The Dirty Dozen and The Devil's Brigade. Bloodlink makes a bit more sense in the world of psychic visions, as our killer and protagonist/antagonist are twin brothers and not only share blood, but visions. One evil, of course. Speaking of blood, let's briefly talk about the island of Blood, where a group of filmmakers attempt to make a music video and are dispatched according to the song's lyrics. This one actually has decent enough kills and expected really stupid characters. The acting is a bit lousy, but again, most audience isn't expecting or wanting Laurence Olivier. It feels a bit like To All Good Night 1980 in terms of pick 'em off format on an isolated island, and this year's Honeymoon Whore as well. Speaking of which, Honeymoon Whore, along with a couple others, really let one know the huge drop-off in quality when it comes to slashers from the previous year to this one. A villainous couple open a resort for newlyweds. Eventually, the couple start getting picked off. It's paced poorly, the characters constantly remind the audience how horny they are, yet the nudity is minimal. Till Death Do Us Part is another marriage horror, which sports an okay cast of James Keach and Matt Craven, where Keach attempts to do a written piece on the so-called Doctor of the Resort. It has some religious-oriented murders and a horn dog character that stand out. Overall, it ends up being better than Honeymoon Whore, but lacks an annoying law official, so that helps. It can't go without mention, the sheriff in Honeymoon Whore gets the award for the most annoying, lazy, dogshit sheriff in any 80s slasher. His scenes were reshoots and had an element of out-of-place comedy. Speaking of lazy sheriffs, Death Screams is a solid regional slasher film starring a lot of cast from 1981's A Day of Judgment. It also sports one of the worst sheriffs in the slasher world.
Adam, let's just get you home.
His performance is charming and his character is likable even after he apathetically answers our final girl's screams of why, with a monotone exhale. I don't know. Death Screams holds the kills until the final act, where we see a group of teens, often played by adults, picked off in gruesome fashion. The nudity, the characters, and the small town fare add a nice regional flair that elevates Death Screams out of the bottom tier and into the hearts of slasher completists. Keeping with the regional slasher theme, John A. Russo, writer, filmmaker, and George A. Romero, collaborator, adapted his book, Midnight, first published in 1980, into a feature film for his horror directorial debut. Any fans of George A. Romero and his Dead films know that Pennsylvania has a wonderful charm about it, and makes for the perfect setting for a horror film. Whether it's the great farms, cities, or like in Midnight, the small rural towns and hilly backwoods, Midnight takes a page out of the satanic panic of the 70s and the backwoods killer families similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Midnight includes some solid performances from John Amplas and Lawrence Tierney in a very ambivalent role, as well as a memorable score, with a great song at the center of it. One of the last of Edward Montaro's productions, as well as one of Christopher George's last films, Mortuary uses what seems to be a satanic cult as the villains of the story. But it just turns out to be a red herring, and the real villain is a soon-to-be star. By looking at the cast, it shouldn't be too hard to guess. The film ends in a scene that is reminiscent of Psycho and 1981 slasher's Happy Birthday to Me in Madhouse, and of course, like Pieces, 1982. The backdrop of the mortuary was a brilliant setting for a horror movie, and the film does benefit from it. But it benefits even more from the trailer featuring Michael Berryman, who doesn't appear in the actual film at all.
Mortuary.
Jack Scholder, after working as an editor on films like The Burning, got a chance to direct his own horror film from the then new company New Line Cinema. Similar to Midnight in the aspect that we have more than one killer, and unlike 1981 where it seemed to have a non-stop barrage of dual killers in films, we have a quartet of them in Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark is fascinating in many aspects, from the cast to the little touches of nightmare scenes that feel a bit like New Line's future franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street. A group of dangerous mental patients break out during a blackout and decide to try and kill their new doctor. The group of lunatic features the talents of legends Martin Landau and Jack Palance in two of their best roles. They are also joined by 6'7" Erwin Van Lith, playing a monster of a pedophile who brings another level of horror to the film. Featuring punk rock music concert and the siege narrative, it still takes time to give our baddies some great moments, and a few slasher kills. Donald Pleasance also stars as a hippie doctor who runs the facility and works brilliantly as the antithesis to his Dr. Loomis character, as he smokes weed and embraces new age alternative therapy. Exploitation director Don Jones took a stab at the slasher this year using a classic backdrop, The Forest. The Forest stars Gary Kent, actor and stuntman, as our killer. Most people don't hold The Forest in very high regard, but it has its fans. Road horror is a pretty popular subgenre within thrillers and slashers. Death Valley is one of the better ones. Peter Bingsley, or better known to people as Ralphie from A Christmas Story, sees something he shouldn't on a road trip, with his mother played by Catherine Hicks and her new boyfriend Paul Lamont. It's a classic setup. Death Valley is done with great suspense and some really solid character-building moments. Wilford Brimley is great as the good-natured sheriff, and Stephen McHattie is equally as good as his reverse. Unfortunately, while writing this, the release date has changed to 1981 due to a preview screening. On this rare occasion, I'm ignoring it. Not always is our killer in a slasher film a man or monster. In Mongrel, our victims come to an end by a vicious dog. Or so it seems. Robert Burns, set designer of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and star of Confessions of a Serial Killer, directs this regional Texas psychological slasher with the talents of Mitch Pileggi and Aldo Ray, in a much better performance than his one from Dark Sanity. It's not perfect, but it's worth nibbling on. A couple films in 1982 sport a nasty subplot where our killer is the offspring of rape. Paul Lynch stays in the slasher genre with Humongous. It is quite different from his film Prom Night 1980. The Beast Within by Felipe Mora sports the same catalyst as Humongous, but with hugely different results. It's a bit more complicated than Humongous, and the Mora film isn't a slasher, but both sport some rather nasty touches. In Humongous, a group of kids end up getting stranded on Dog Island, where it seems that the only inhabitants are a pack of wild dogs. But soon enough, to their dismay, they learn about a hulking, deformed beastman who has recently been left to fend for himself when his caretaker dies. Similar to this year's House on Sorority Row, Humongous suffered with bad prints on VHS until it was released on DVD and Blu-ray. Humongous is guilty at times of pacing issues, but creates some solid suspense and kills by using its location. Canada had a lot of horror films, as we saw earlier, but it's a noteworthy takeaway to notice how many slashers they had. Going back to Murder by Phone, which mostly works because instead of threats from the phone, we get actual deaths caused by it, there's also a nice mystery angle to help with the intrigue. John Houseman seemed to be getting all his horror movies out of his system towards the end of his career. The Fog, 1980, Ghost Story, 81, and finally Murder by Phone, 1982. Even TV horror would get down the slasher subgenre a bit, with Hotline, where Linda Carter gets a job at a suicide hotline. Soon enough, she gets a lot of strange and threatening calls in the vein of Don't Answer the Phone, Black Christmas, and When a Stranger Calls. A nice mystery helps this one move along well, with a good supporting cast. More of a thriller than a horror film, but still enough of a slasher. Fantasies Falls a daytime soap opera writer, played by Suzanne Pichette. Cast members of her show start getting picked off, filled with a ton of red herrings, and the killer's identity is a bit of a surprise. Before we move into the psychological slashers, many of which I think qualify as horror, although some I feel a bit more in the thriller realm, I'd like to discuss a few of the supernatural slashers, or films that play with a bit of the more fantastical elements instead of just mad killers. Silent Range again is in line with the mad killer, but has an element of science gone wrong. It's essentially two films in one, a buddy cop action film and a superhuman slasher. They come together for a weird mixture that would be repeated by Norris in some aspects with Hellbound. Black Room isn't exactly a supernatural slasher, but it plays with the subgenres that would be. A realistic vampire story about a pair of siblings who rent out a room under the guise to people who want to carry out their sexual exploits. The pair end up feeding on the sexual partners of the renter after they watch the session. Black Room is a little hidden gem and lived in VHS hell for many years. But now we can finally see the great Steadicam work. Black Room shares similarities with Pure Blood from this year, but with some dark, psychological sexual politics instead of a look into classism. An early role from Christopher McDonald and Linnea Quigley is also worth noting. Again, this falls in line with the horror film being the place for new talent for some and a place for the stars to flicker. Ghost Dance is a sort of variant on the Egyptian Curse and Possession film. A Native American is possessed by an ancient being in an archaeological dig site and soon begins violently killing off the members responsible for the dig. A Southwest slasher atmosphere sets it a bit apart. Finally, it received a solid release in recent years, so the days of muddy VHS transfers are over. One can finally see the decent kills and downbeat ending. Another 1982 supernatural slasher also suffered the pitch black VHS fate, The Slayer. Slayer is J.S. Cardone's directorial debut. The use of nightmares is ahead of its time, and instead of your standard premonitions, which can be used similarly, it feels like a breath of fresh air. Cardone does a beautiful job setting up the foreboding dread through our lead's paintings, out of her dreams and eventually into reality. The shot of the vacation house on Tybee Island is great and sets the mood. For The Slayer, a shot of a structure is enough to let you know of your impending doom. The ideas are big and original, that your fears and dreams can become a true manifestation and kill. It's something that would be used slightly different in this year's Ascender as well, and of course in things like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 years later. Superstition is a bit more of a standard slasher with the idea that our killer is just a revengeful witch haunting the grounds where she was killed. She crawls out of the nearby lake every night searching for victims. It's gory enough with a period piece flashback and an absolute iconic shot on the stairs that make it worth watching. Boarding House is one of the first and only horror SOV movies made for the theater and blown up on 35. It's a completely insane nonsense movie involving telekinesis, bloody breast, person-to-animal mutations, suntan occultists, and a bunch of murders. It's earned its cult following on more than one account. The supernatural slasher adds a lot of weird elements to the subgenre, contemplating how to overcome the threats. No longer can our killer be stabbed or blown up. One must use fate, religion, or neuroscientific means to defeat them. Again, I would like to briefly touch upon the parody slasher, which came to fruition with Student Bodies in 1981, next to the spoof and parody movies like Airplane, 1980. Class Reunion, Wacko, and Pandemonium aren't what anyone would call masterpieces, but they all have decent casts of comedians, and the mileage will vary depending on your taste. Class Reunion was produced by National Lampoon, so the silliness was expected. It's directed by Michael Miller, who did the more straight slasher film Silent Rage this year as well. Pandemonium was done by Alfred Soul, who couldn't have made anything further from his 1976 film Alice, Sweet Alice. Pandemonium, like Class Reunion, is a fun watch to spot some old talent and some up-and-coming comedians, but for the most part, it's a tedious ride, with the exception of a cameo by Cindy Lassick.
Want to see your dirty pillows?
Those aren't dirty pillows, Mama. They're breasts.
Not those. Those are titties. Those are dirty pillows.
Those aren't my dirty pillows, Mama. They're his dirty pillows.
They're not dirty pillows. They're breasts.
Butt out!
For what it's worth, Wacko by Greg Clark is my personal favorite, most likely due to a couple of the insane performances by the likes of George Kennedy and Joe Don Baker. Oftentimes, slashers don't always stick to the format of a group of people being murdered by a killer or killers. The film's focus can either be on a serial killer, mentally ill lead, or police officer. A lot of these films still play in the slasher world, or a slasher adjacent, but there's just a tiny different flavor. While others are more psychological, thriller horror, or something in between. Visiting Hours, for example, spends a lot of time with our violent offender Michael Ironside, a serial killer who focuses on a journalist who wrote an article about feminism. Don't Answer the Phone from 2 years previous followed a serial killer obsessed with another media personality, and The Seduction from 1982 does as well. What sets Visiting Hours apart from many of its contemporaries is a fairly well-done psychological aspect on our killer. Ironside creates a memorable psycho who is willing to go to some uncomfortable places. On the flip side, Visiting Hours follows suit with previous killer movies like Hospital Massacre and Halloween 2, where a lot of our stalking and slashing takes place in a hospital. Director William Byron Hillman directed a horror film entitled The Photographer in 1974, about a murderous photographer. It would seem in 1982 he wanted to come back to that well with Double Exposure. A middle-aged photographer begins having violent nightmares of his models, and other women he sleeps with, being murdered. A common trope of the killers is of course a photographer. Don't Answer the Phone, Murder Lust, and many real-life criminals such as Jeffrey Dahmer. So having our lead being this man with a haunted past and struggling with violent dreams of course points to him as our killer. But amongst the sleaze, murders, and psychological aspects, we have a bit of a twist. A little bit of a hidden gem, actually. Joe Spinell and Carolyn Monroe reunite for the last horror film, where our deranged fanatic isn't just an aspiring photographer, but a filmmaker. Joe Spinell is a cabbie obsessed with Monroe, and decides to invade the Cannes Film Festival to try and convince her to be in his film. What follows is a series of violent murders, unbeknownst cameos, and a wonderful over-the-top creepy performance by Spinell. Very much like Double Exposure, maybe our suffering psycho isn't the monster he may appear to be. The last horror film in its uncut form features some great kills, some very memorable shots, and a cool little meta stinger. The perfect example of obsession from 1982 is the previously mentioned German film Der Fan. Fitting into the psychological horror, it encapsulates the fantasy world that people who stalk and become obsessed with create for themselves. The score by Rheingold helps create the world that Simone, played perfectly by Desiree Nosbush, has created. The Seduction has Andrew Stevens becoming obsessed with the newscaster played by Morgan Fairchild. It's more of a creepy stalking thriller that turns into a film about vigilantism. Unhinged is a nice little regional psychological slasher that follows three girls who are caught in a rainstorm, in typical horror fashion. Due to the injury, they are somewhat trapped and begin to realize their host, a mother and daughter, are a little bit more unhinged than they had originally thought. Another film that suffers from poor transfers and a bad reputation that I think is unfairly earned. Fits nicely in the dark sexual politics of Tenebrae and Visiting Hours from this year, and obviously is inspired by Psycho, which never stops being lifted from and inspiring films. See this year's Written in Fog as well. Ever since Psycho, it seemed to be a very common trope to have a mama's boy killer, and it seems to be the motivation for many of our modern maniacs. That fear, hatred, illness being instilled or passed on through genetics or circumstances from a loved one is scary, and tragically relatable. The Aussie film Next to Kin is a great thriller horror, with a wonderful mystery for our lead character to dive into. With the death of her mother, she inherits an old folks' home that her mother and aunt used to run. Before long, strange drowning deaths begin to occur. Her mind starts to crack with the invasion of nightmares. With the help of her mother's diary, she begins to piece together why these deaths may be occurring and why she may be breaking. Geriatrics are front and center, and at times they are used as red herrings, but also as an effective foresight into one's own future. Both a comedic and horrible reminder of the future. Sean Cunningham started the 1980s with the game changer in Friday the 13th, and his horror follow-up isn't exactly that. It's still a solid thriller with a wicked baddie performance by Rip Torn as a kidnapper and killer. One thing that stands out about A Stranger Is Watching is its portrayal of homeless people. At one point, it almost seems like every character our victim comes in contact with who lives on the streets is either a drooling lunatic or a violent would-be perpetrator. In more modern times, we often see a movie come out in the same year with the same title, but 1982 it was a bit less likely. Two films called Victims were both released in 1982. One a TV film where Howard Hessman is a serial rapist who is acquitted and the victims decide to take the law into their own hands. In the same vein as Act of Vengeance or Ladies Club, just not quite as extreme and less horror. Our Other Victims is a sleazy serial killer film. Our killer's reasoning is fairly standard. Of course, he suffers from mother issues causing a violent hatred towards women. Tony Borno stars and directs a dark, gritty, mean-spirited, LA-located film that I'm surprised is fairly forgotten. The end of the film showcases the demise of our killer's mother in a flashback that is played simultaneously with his own in an effective finale. Still the Night is a psychological thriller with a couple A-list actors. Roy Scheider is a psychiatrist that gets involved with a criminal case when one of his patients is murdered. Meryl Streep was having an affair with said patient and also becomes involved. Before long, the killer starts to stalk our good doctor. Fairly procedural, with a couple surreal flares, a bit of an over-the-top killer reveal, and sometimes unorthodox structure. It's well acted and directed, but a little plain. It does, however, fit into the mentally ill killer and revenge wife aspects, like we see in Woman of Fire 1982. A lot of the serial killer films or thrillers have a little bit of believability about them, whilst the other side of horror usually doesn't. But the based on true story angle in horror was pretty strong in 1982, even when it comes to hauntings and possessions. The popularity of The Exorcist, both film and book, I'm sure was a very helpful precursor to The Entity, written by Frank D. Felitta. Like The Exorcist, it was inspired by allegorical account. Frank D. Felitta had heard about the story of Doris Bither, who claimed to have been repeatedly sexually assaulted by 3 entities, and he wrote the book that was turned into the film. Frank D. Felitta was no stranger to horror films, as he had already directed the excellent TV horror film Dark Night of the Scarecrow in 1981, and written Audrey Rose, which was already adapted into a film. Cindy J. Fury stepped behind the camera to direct this one. Fury was a well-established director, but he hadn't done many horror films. But with Barbara Hershey playing the lead, and with his direction, The Entity manages to be a completely unsettling film, which is well adapted from the source material. The pounding score works in place of a tangible villain. The Entity also stars Ron Silver, as again another helping doctor, similar to his role in Silent Rage from this year as well. Although things like Poltergeist weren't based in fact, the film does handle the paranormal in a similar fashion to The Entity, with scientists and doctors working together to try to figure out what has happened to the Freeling's young daughter, Carol Ann. A lot of times the discussion of Poltergeist always turns into a debate about who directed it. Was it the listed director Tobe Hooper or the producer Steven Spielberg, whose touches are undeniable on the film with its portrayal of the suburbs and somewhat sweet family presentation. Saying that, Hooper has delivered some masterpieces of his own and worked well with special effects in films like Life Force 1985 and to a lesser extent with his remake of Invaders from Mars 1986. It's not impossible for Hooper to have directed Poltergeist, but it's impossible to talk about it without having someone bring it up. There's also the controversy surrounding the film with all the tragedies that lie within from murders and mixed diagnosed illnesses. Craig T. Nelson, Jo Beth Williams, Heather Rourke, James Karen, and Zelda Rubinstein all turn in great performances. One Dark Night also features a bit of paranormal studies, where the occult is believed by many of the characters, and they address it as real-world belief. The bulk of the film takes place in a mausoleum, where a supernatural vessel has been buried, Raymar. The opening of the film shows a wonderful slow tracking shot that reveals a heap of victims and the body of our soon-to-be mini necromancer, who had drained the life force from his casualties and takes the power of telekinesis with him to his grave. Throughout the film, his daughter has premonitions similar to Killing Hour, Bloodsong, and Bloodling, warning her of her father's growing power. Being an 80s movie, a group of college girls, as an initiation ritual, make a new pledge, Meg Tilly, attempt to stay the night inside Raymar's tomb. When a couple of them decide to prank our pledge, all hell breaks loose, as maggot-filled corpses are tossed about. A very good directorial debut from Tom McLaughlin, who would find success in the horror genre with Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, and Sometimes They Come Back. The Entity and One Dark Night had some bumpy releases and weren't widely available until after Poltergeist had come out, and by then both were considered lesser films in comparison and accused of lifting. Amityville 2: The Possession is murky when it comes to the mixture of allegorical count and true crime. Of course, much more of a demonic possession film than a haunting, it should be mentioned in this segment for the real-life aspects of it. Ronnie DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family in 1974, and among his claims, he blamed demonic possession. In 1975, the Lutz family would move into the murder house. A book was published in 1977 about the alleged supernatural and demonic happenings that took place at the time of their occupancy. In 1979, a hit movie was made by Stuart Rosenberg. A court battle took place between George Lutz and Dino De Laurentiis about the sequel, which would end up a prequel and portray the DeFeo murders in Amityville. The director chosen was Dallamano Dellamini, who is known in Italy for directing excellent socio-political and crime films. Screenwriter was Tommy Lee Wallace, who didn't believe a word of the Lutz story, and the book it was based on was written by Hans Holzer, who had a vested interest and belief in the paranormal. The crew was a mixture of Italian, Mexican, and Americans and filmed a huge part in Mexico. The cast is tremendous: Rotana Alda, Diane Franklin, James Olsen, Moses Gunn, Andrew Prine, Leonardo Cimino, and an outstanding and terrifying performance from Burt Young as an abusive father. The first half of the film, with its demented family dynamics and eerie settings, work wonderfully. But after the murders, the film turns into a fairly standard possession flick in the vein of The Exorcist and loses some of its allure. The sender also attempts to base its supernatural happenings into some sort of science-based therapy. The film opens up boldly with the suicide attempt. Zyko Ivanek is admitted to the hospital as John Doe, and his past is pried into, and his visions become realities for those around him. A real-life manifestation of someone's trauma brought into the real world. Memories into real menacing horrors for those that are witness to it. A nice mystery sits at the center of it. Also, another hospital horror. Don't Go to Sleep follows suit with last year, giving TV horror a great name. For the film public that claims there are no such things as elevated horror before the likes of Ari Aster or Robert Eggers, this one should be examined. Don't Go to Sleep is a great study about a family suffering lost. The arguments, the emotions, and reactions all seem to come from a place of genuine human behavior. When supernatural horrors start affecting the family after a tragic loss and the bodies pile up, the stress and grief is shown harshly. The opening of the film with its obvious TV score let the audience put their guard down. But by the time Dennis Weaver is dispatched, I can't imagine anyone would be lax. A great little gem of a movie.
And if I want to have 2 martinis or 10 martinis, that is my business, you dig?
Suit yourself.
The Japanese TV film, Cute Devil by legendary director Nobuhiko Obayashi, is hard to place into one category. It plays with the idea that some of its characters have powers such as telekinesis, making the whole ordeal psychological as well. And it most certainly fits in the evil kids category, as we have a good performance from our evil child Alice. There's an interesting dichotomy between our two would-be Carries, about how they feel after wishing deaths on 2 people that both came to fruition. Cute Devil is also a loose remake of The Bad Seed, another 50s horror classic, being reimagined into the 82. Echoes fits into a weird category with films like Life After Life 81, Don't Look in the Attic 82, Second Sight 82, Retribution 87, and many more, where we have reincarnation, past lives, and our lost siblings. It even bleeds into the premonition horror world. The highlight here is actor Mike Kellen in a sizable role. The rest of the film is a tedious affair with a struggling artist and unwatchable character. Hell Has No Boundary also mixes the reincarnation storyline dating back to the Japanese invasion, which is something that is a constant in Hong Kong cinema. The reincarnation of sex is one of the horniest movies of the year. When a father kills her daughter's lover, the mother and daughter hide the head of the lover in the house. Years later, anyone who sets foot in the house becomes sex maniacs. It's not long before it eventually leads to violence. Brazilian horror staple Rogue Rodriguez makes a solid appearance. The horror parody Hysterical stars 3 fairly obnoxious brothers and a slew of good actors like Julie Newmar, Murray Hamilton, Clint Walker, Bud Cort, John Larroquette, and Richard Kiel as a towering ghost. The casting of Murray Hamilton and Richard Kiel makes for one of the most memorable and arguably clever moments of the film. Richard Kiel plays Jaws in the Bond films and is the murdering ghost in Hysterical, is mistaken for a shark. This pushes our sheriff and Clint Walker to plead with the mayor, played by Murray Hamilton, who played the mayor in Jaws, to bring help. Keel soon begins to infect the town and turn them into a group of zombie-like creatures, which has a giant dance scene predating Thriller from the next year. It's worth watching like many of the other horror parodies for the supporting cast. The House Where Evil Dwells is directed by British filmmaker Kevin Connor, who is known for Motel Hell, From Beyond the Grave, and his adventure film starring Doug McClure, who also makes an appearance in this 1982 film. Doug McClure had done Humanoids from the Deep in 1980, so it appears he was getting his feet a little wet when it comes to horror, but never quite dove all in. Also starring Eddie Albert from last year's Galaxy of Terror and the great Susan George from Venom 1981. What would be an otherwise familiar story of a haunted house turned possession flick, where our characters are forced to reenact a previous tragedy, we add an element of strangeness by having Americans staying inside a Japanese house, incorporating samurai and killer crabs. Overall, The House Where Evil Dwells is a somewhat quirky film with a couple bizarre moments. The House in the Woods, aka Haplos, from Philippines, takes a page out of 1981 Italian ghost drama, Ghost of Love, but it most likely predates back to Botandora, the Japanese ghost story, which would fit the film as the Philippines is still struggling in this feature with the stains of the Japanese invasion as mentioned before. The ghost lover subplot is often used in Japanese ghost films, such as The Bride from Hades, 1968, and this year's A Ghost Love Story. The Eyes of Amaryllis is better than expected fantasy ghost period piece about a young girl who is sent to take care of her grandmother on a Nantucket island. She soon discovers the secrets of her grandmother's past and of the sea. Perfect afternoon TV watch. When it comes to hauntings, supernatural occurrences, poltergeists, entities, and possessions, they can all range in terms of how grounded they attempt to appear and what sort of being is behind it, whether it's psychological, supernatural, or even demonic, like Amityville. At times, it's hard to distinguish between hauntings and possessions. They can be combinations where our characters are taken over by ghosts, spirits, or even demons, or are just haunted or terrorized by them. Satan's Baby Doll would suggest devilish intervention, but it's more of a family affair. As a family gathers around in their crypt, they attempt to say goodbye to the matriarch when the daughter notices her eyes jolt open. What is thought to be just a twitch ends up being much more. The group of relatives is a complete mess, either from drug addiction, sexual deviancy, or affairs. In the middle of the night, the daughter is possessed by the spirit of her mother, and with her newfound body, she decides to get revenge on her family by seducing and murdering them, so she can follow her darkest desires, and bed the resident nun. In two versions, hardcore and softcore, fittingly, with an earworm of a score that nearly wears out its welcome. Director Mario Bianchi would mostly stick in the adult world, but did dabble in horror with Murder Secret a few years later. Something must have been in the air in Italy, as they have two possession films involving incest. Manhattan Baby is a possession film, but the entity is from an Egyptian tomb. Somewhat an unknown evil fitting a bit more into his Lovecraftian Gates of Hell films that Fulci had done before. Manhattan Baby isn't quite up to snuff as the maestro's other work around this time, but it's still much better than its reputation, with some creepy atmosphere, some regulars, and plenty of expected eye shots. Oh, and a few 80s laser beams. None of these supernatural aspects tend to bleed into the demonic, with the exception of Amityville 2. Many of 1982's hauntings, possessions, and ghost stories attempted to take the scientific approach on an unnamed evil. But one thing is for certain, the devil has always been a constant in the horror genre, and in 1982 it was no different. To hurt God, says Diane Franklin in Amityville 2 Possession, the simple rebuttal is the reason we are given why Ronnie has seduced and fornicated with his sister. To hurt God. Taboos are often broken in horror and in demonic possession films. Nothing quite like a crucifix to jog your memory. Satan's Mistress is a sleazy, surreal Incubus-style film where our lead is visited by a dark stranger in her dreams. Of course, an affair happens, as she is often neglected by her husband. The entire thing ends in a big fiery orgy. Not perfect, but a decent low-budget film with Brick Eklund. The Bloody Sect is exactly as titled. A group of Satan worshippers attempt to get Satan reborn in the world. Also works as good pregnancy horror. The main knock on this movie is the awful special effects at the end, and the killing of a real toad, which is standard for a lot of films at the time. But when compared to the poor effects in the film, to kill a real animal seems less like an attempt at realism and mostly just comes across as laziness. Hauntings, possessions, and slashers seem to be some of the bigger genres of the year. But like the devil, the classic monsters of yesteryear don't really die. It amazes me that every year of the 80s we have at least one Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story. In 1980 we had the comedy Dr. Heckle and Mr. Hype, and a BBC version. In 1981, we had the Hindi version, and this year we are back to comedy with a parody horror film, Jekyll and Hyde Together Again, which feels more like an extended skit from SNL. Tim Thomerson flexes his comedy muscles in an early role, and a few laughs are landed. Another surprise is a couple mummy films. The Secret of the Mummy is the feature-length debut by Ivan Cardoso, which follows a mad scientist who uses his elixir to bring to life a mummy. The mummy goes on capturing naked women, which are promptly locked in a cage and driven mad. One even seems to be turning into a werewolf? Feels a bit like National Mummy meets Santo with sleaze. The film decides it not only wants to be completely bonkers in the plot, but in the film stock as well, as it jumps from color to black and white, on a whim. The only Brazilian mad scientist kidnapping mummy movie. Then again, who knows what the rest of the 80s has to bring. Time Walker is another oddity, originally a TV pilot, eventually turned into a feature film. We have a mummy who is hit with radioactive X-rays at a college campus. These X-rays somehow bring this mummy back to life. Our bandaged buddy soon is driven to collect jewels that were stolen off his body. A tedious mummy run-amok science fiction time travel movie somewhat disguised as a college campus war picture. James Karen is the highlight, and it's nice to see Austin Stoker as well, as Sherry Belafonte. But the film overall is more interesting for a few individuals behind the camera, including Richard Band, who turns in a solid score, set designer Robert Burns, and its distribution from New World Entertainment. Not exactly a classic monster per se, but over the years Hunchbacks have been adapted to horror, whether it be Universal Films and other gothic horrors. The Hunchback of Notre Dame has been adapted numerous times, not quite as much as Dr. Jekyll or the Phantom of the Opera, but enough to compare. Many classic actors have donned the titular role of the bell ringer, but seeing Anthony Hopkins as Quasi is a treat. A lot of the Victor Hugo story is cut out, but the end result is pretty solid, well-acted, and well-produced TV film. Also featuring a hunchback this year is the previously mentioned Goodnight Mr. Monster. Although there aren't any werewolf films, a couple take major inspiration from the genre, including the Aussie director Felipe Mora's The Beast Within, a violent exploitation monster exploitation revenge picture. Mora would go to direct 2 sequels in the Howling franchise. The Beast Within sports a great list of actors from Ronnie Cox, Dodd Gordon, Lucas Skew, and Peckinpah regulars R.G. Armstrong and L.Q. Jones. Written by future horror director Tom Holland, we have a pretty bizarre script which reflects the 50s and the style of coming of age, like I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, Werewolf, take your pick. This time around, our lead and Paul Clemens, also an FX artist this year, One Dark Night, is a spawn of monster rape. Again, I mentioned a million times, similar to Humongous. 17 years after his birth, doubling his puberty, he is drawn back to his place of creation, where he starts to turn into a cicada man and carry out his revenge and eventual urges. With elements of Curse of the Werewolf and teenage angst 50s films, the swampy background makes for a great sleazy carryover from the 70s. Cat People by Paul Schrader also has a bit of a werewolf influence and manages to choose a wonderful location in Louisiana. The score by Giorgio Moroder is fantastic, as is the David Bowie track. As far as remakes are concerned, it's a very good one, where it decides to do something different than its predecessor. In 1942, the sex had to be hidden, but in 1982, Cat People is free to embrace the raw sexual energy that turns Malcolm McDowell and Natasha Kinski into panthers every time they have intercourse with someone, not of their own kind. The only way to turn back is to fulfill a bloodlust. Featuring clever transformations and good to great performances, Annette O'Toole, Ruby Dee, and John Hurd also star, the latter in a pretty complicated obsessive role. The TV horror film I Desire, directed by John Moxley, City of the Dead, and TV Horrors The Night Stalker and No Place to Hide, 81, is one of the most traditional of the vampire films this year. The year previous, the underrated Dave Naughton dealt with lycotropes. This time around, while working as a coroner's assistant, Brad Dorfit comes in one night disguised as a priest and asks to see a murder victim's body. Things don't quite add up, and in a bit of a precursor to Fright Night and a continuation of Night Stalker, Dave Naughton starts to believe there is a vampire prostitute who feeds on men. Not pure of heart. Not pure of faith. A really solid and underseen TV film, worth your time. Dracula Rises from the Coffin, as mentioned, is a South Korean answer to Hammer. The story is close enough to many renditions we have seen. It's decently shot, but until more English-friendly options are available, it might not be worth watching just yet. Vampire Inspector is a Japanese TV period piece. A vampire washes up on shore and begins a vendetta. Solid Christian iconography with a love reincarnation story and swordplay. It's a well-made, good mixture of genres with a pair of great vampire brides. Ferret Vampire is a completely bizarre conspiracy-style horror film about a car that runs on blood. Years before Blood Car, it's a weird, zany subject that isn't quite like anything else in 1982, and most certainly not like any of the other vampire films. Vampirismus is worth seeking out for fans of Italian TV horror. The reveal at the end is quite haunting. Lastly, there is an animated short based on children's book series, Manicula, the Vampire Rabbit, about a family's new pet who drains all the local garden's veggies. It's cute and short enough to keep your attention. As far as Frankenstein stories go, Britannia Hospital might be the only one. Although not a horror film, it has its elements for sure. Especially when it comes to the mad scientist angle, with supercomputers and using parts to create man. In fact, the scene where Malcolm McDowell is resurrected and decides to rebel and rip himself to shreds is about as horror as you can get. Filled with satire, dark comedy, and social unrest, the finale to the cult trilogy by films by Lindsay Anderson is worth seeking out. In 1980, zombies seemed to be everywhere. By 1982, zombies started to have a bit of a decline. Of course, by 85, business would pick up. As for 82, we just have a handful. The biggest and best is John Rollins' beautiful and haunting Living Dead Girl. Francois Blanchard is brought back to life in her family crypt when a trio of criminals dump toxic waste in her tomb. Blanchard isn't quite sure where she is or what she is at first, but has the urge to kill and drink blood. Marina Piero plays Blanchard's best friend, who's in constant grief. The two link up once more, and Piero will do anything to keep her best friend and emotional lover alive. Anything. The surrounding village and farmlands are gorgeous, as is the camera work, including all the classic stuff you'd expect from John Rollin. The image at the end of the film cements it as one of Rollin's best. There are, of course, the two previously mentioned Franco films, Mansion of the Living Dead being the superior over Oasis of Zombies, which falls in the tracks of last year's Nazi zombie film Night of the Zombies by Joel M. Reed and John Rollin's Zombie Lake. Curse of the Cannibal Confederates or The Screaming Dead, whichever you prefer, is Tony Malinowski's follow-up to the god-awful Night of Horror 1981. Curse is somewhat of a remake of the previous film, but has better camera work and special effects. It ends up being marginally better. If you ever wanted to see a gang of zombies who all practice different martial arts, fight with a group of ragtag heroes and white slavers, then Raw Force is the only movie for you. Never boring and not always coherent, but it sure is fun. Shot in black and white, I Was a Zombie for the FBI is much more in the science fiction vein than anything else. In take on the 50s film, we have a couple agents try to stop a group of aliens from turning the world into zombies. A pair of criminals get captured and are forced to work for them. A bit too long in its original version. It's not without its charm though, and for what it sets out to do, it does it fairly successfully. Romero's anthology Creepshow features 5 stories with of course a rap, but 2 of them do feature creatures from beyond the grave, of which Romero was synonymous with. All of them after revenge, and one looking for his cake. The cast is one of the finest Romero ever had, including Ed Harris, Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, Hal Holbrook, Adrienne Barbeau, Fritz Weaver, E.G. Marshall, Tom Atkins, Stephen King, and a slew of Pittsburgh working actors that any Romero fanatic should spot. More like an actual EC comic than the Amicus pictures, which mostly predate it by a decade, its success comes from its style, score, special effects, and an overall fun spirit of just desserts, which most anthology films and TV series thrive on. Texas director Larry Buchanan directed one of the worst monster movies of the year with The Loch Ness Horror, an utter and complete snooze fest. The monster is cheap and looks crummy, yet is still the most interesting part of the film. Another aquatic monster film is Blood Tide with Martin Kove, Jose Ferrer, and an intense James Earl Jones. The locations are gorgeous and the mythos behind the monster is unique enough to keep your attention. A brother ends up on an isolated Greek island looking for his sister. Along with her, he also finds James Earl Jones, a criminal diver. They uncover a secret evil curse within the island, a sort of Lovecraftian being. The best scene in the film involves a painting being restored. The reveal is well done. There's something about old art portraying something from the past that has come back that just creates a chilling scare. With, of course, the expected 1982 premonitions that are so prevalent. Piranha 2: The Spawning at first glance would fit into the more with the animals attack subgenre, but this time around our carnivorous super piranhas have mutated to be able to fly. Yes, flying piranha. James Cameron's directorial debut, well, at least part of it is. Apparently, Ovidio G. Asinadas fired Cameron and directed most of it. Ovidio had directed Madhouse the year before, and Cameron had worked on the Corman production Galaxy of Terror. The film has some decent effects and some solid gore. The entire thing is so ridiculous, it's sort of hard to not enjoy it at least a little bit. A huge genre from the 50s to the 70s was the animal attack subgenre. Animals turn against their masters, they become radioactive, mutated, or evil, or a new species is discovered. By the time 1982 rolled around, it wasn't quite as productive as it once was. White Dog by Sam Fuller is much less in the traditional sense of animal attacks film, and fits more in with the drama. But there are bits of where we have our canines stalking the streets and attacking. Hard to really even consider White Dog a horror film, as it comes across more as a film to shine a light at the atrocities of what man does to man by using animals and other means. That racism is a taught behavior. Paul Winfield plays a dog trainer who tries to teach a white German shepherd to not attack and kill black folks on sight. White Dog still packs a powerful punch to this day and sports a good Ennio Morricone score. More in the traditional sense is Deadly Eyes, where rats are mutated and grow giant due to contaminated corn. When their food supply is destroyed, they head to the sewer system for some subterranean carnage. Amongst the victims are babies, Scatman Crothers, like mentioned before, and a bunch of the city's elite when a celebration is held to show off the new subway station. Vastly entertaining shellac based on a James Herbert book from 1974. Mongrel and Humongous use violent dogs within their plots, but the main culprit behind the violence is something much worse. Centipede Horror and Calamity of Snakes are more curse-driven horrors instead of your standard 50s or 70s style animal attacks films. Again, just brushing past Panic, as it's a standard man-turned-to-monster run-amok story, but doesn't fit in with any classic beast, really. Toxic Slime Creature is a short that follows another mutated sort of creature that attacks a group of factory workers. A bit shoddy and basically with a non-ending. When it comes to monsters, Swamp Thing is more of your Beauty and Beast style story, where a disgusting-looking swamp monster with superpowers and a beautiful heart fights back against the evil while saving the pretty girl. It's hard to place into the horror category, but it does have a lot of appeal to fans, with a cast, director, and themes. It's great seeing David Hess and Nicholas Worth work with Craven again. It's always a pleasure to see Adrian Barbeau, who managed to work with Romero, Craven, and Carpenter in the same year, although the last one is only a voice. It's always nice to hear a score from Harry Manfredini as well, who New York is one of the best backdrops for a film. 42nd Street, Times Square, peep shows, the Chrysler Building, but usually people think of serial killers, vigilantes, road cops, street gangs, not monsters when they think New York, especially when they think New York horror. That's what makes the next two films from 1982 so special. Both sporting stop-motion effects made by two legendary New York figures. First up is the debut of Frank Henenlotter with Basket Cased, one of the wildest, craziest, most twisted revenge tales around. Dwayne carries around his deformed former conjoined twin around in a basket, while they navigate amongst the locals in New York City and take care of their hit list. There isn't quite any little creature horror films like this, with its sleaze, gore, and bizarre dark humor. It's a real treat to watch the brothers hang around the Hotel Broslin. If I didn't know better, I'd say that Q, the Winged Serpent, was Larry Cohen's wildest script. But when you have alien messiahs and killer desserts, it's hard to confidently say that a script about a giant winged serpent that eats New Yorkers for lunch takes the prize. David Carradine and Richard Roundtree do really well and don't quite get the credit they deserve. The absolute showstopper is Michael Moriarty, as a low-rent criminal piano player who accidentally finds out where the giant serpent's nest is and holds the city ransom. What makes Q so cool is not only the giant monster aspect, but it's the two other plots going on. One involving a criminal heist, and one involving police detectives trying to solve a series of ritualistic murders. The dialogue is great, seemingly mixed with scripted lines and improv.
Sounded okay to me.
Yeah? What the fuck do you mean?
If you haven't been paying attention, 1982 is riddled with 50s-style films and love letters. So it only makes sense that we would get a few science fiction horror monster movies mentioned before we move to the elephant in the room. Forbidden World is a good New World Pictures follow-up to the 1981's Galaxy of Terror. Forbidden World seems to be a bit more self-aware and adds some comedy to it. Although the cast may not be as iconic as Galaxy's, it still has a solid one with Jesse Vinton and an early role from Michael Bowen. Any shortfalls it has are smoothed over by the awesome score and the wonderfully bizarre edited sex scene that keeps cutting back to a diegetic sax player. Oh, there is also a weird blob monster with rows and rows of teeth that is defeated with cancer. Night Beast is one of regional director Don Doller's best, mixing in some sex, nudity, and gore, missing from his first two films, The Alien Factor and Fiend. Night Beast starts off with a bang, a classic story of an unwelcome guest from beyond the stars. Instead of having one or two people vanish as the alien attempt a slow takeover, our brown jumpsuit wearing laser gun slinging extraterrestrial comes in with extreme prejudice, eviscerating and vaporizing the populace. A very homemade film with a lot of classic tricks. It's got a great family community feel about it. It ends up being one of the coolest low-budget films of the year. Extra from Harry Bromley Davenport has to go down in history as one of the strangest and unnerving alien films of all time, sporting a truly horrifying abduction scene where a father is taken by extraterrestrials in front of his son. It's topped fairly quickly in the film by the alien's return. A creature spider walks in such an unnerving and unconventional way it has become a popular internet gif. We see our creature scurry backward from the dark country road before a car nearly hits it. If the intense first 20 minutes wasn't enough already, a woman gives birth to our abducted man who seeks out his son. What follows is lesser than the first act, but still wild enough where our young boy, having the connection with his now alien father, has the power to turn his thoughts into reality. Again, something that was explored in this year's The Sender and The Slayer. It's also reminiscent of the classic Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, later adapted for the film by Joe Dante in 1983. New Line Cinema didn't produce the film, but it did end up distributing it, making it one of the early horror films the company handled. After having some successes with Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York, it was director John Carpenter's big Hollywood break to do a remake of The Thing from Another World, 1951. Or better put, another adaptation from John Campbell's Who Goes There. The Thing was supposed to fit more with the original story than the Howard Hawks produced version. Bill Lancaster, son of Burt Lancaster, wrote the script. Carpenter was convinced to do a bigger and more professional casting process, and even in post brought on legendary composer Ennio Morricone. By today's standards, The Thing is considered one of the greatest horror films ever made, but we all know back then it was different. When a pair of Norwegians seemingly attacks an American outpost in Antarctica, the group of men decide to fly to their camp to see what happened.
What is that? Is that a man in there or something?
What they find is some sort of alien creature frozen in the ice. When they get it back and it thaws out, they realize the dog that arrived seconds before the attack isn't quite what they thought it was, and the creature in the ice still has cellular activity. The men soon begin to realize that maybe one or a handful of them ain't what they say they are. In the great tradition of paranoid horror science fiction films comes one, if not the best of its kind. The cast, from Kurt Russell all the way to Peter Mahoney, are perfect, and the effects by 23-year-old Rob Bottin are what live in infamy forever. The ever-changing monster, absorbing and adapting to survive, keeping you guessing who is the thing and when did it get to them. Carpenter also took the time to produce and score while working on The Thing in 1982, on Tommy Lee Wallace's Halloween 3: Season of the Witch. Halloween 3 as a subgenre is a bit hard to place, as the story is one of the most creative of the year. Nigel Neal wrote the script but wanted his name taken off due to problems with the producer John Carpenter. From my understanding, Neal, Carpenter, and director Tommy Lee Wallace are responsible for the final script. But only Wallace goes credited. In the 50s, Neal wrote a TV series, The Quatermass Experiment. It was later adapted into a series of films in 55, 57, and 67 by Hammer Studios. The best way to describe Halloween 3 would be to say it's somewhat in the style of the Quatermass story, with big ideas and science fiction elements, yet more in tune with the scores, special effects, and characters of the 80s. Conal Cochran, played by Dan O'Harely, is one of the best villains of the 80s, a toy maker who devises a plan to use Stonehenge and Halloween Mask and somehow trigger the deaths of children with a memorable jingle that has unlimited airtime. 30 days till Halloween. The story follows Tom Atkins, a drunk divorced doctor who managed to catch on with the help of a murdered toy store owner's daughter, as they try to figure it out before it's too late. The ending feels like a carryover from the 70s, and it seems like 1982 might be one of the last years with some consistent bleak endings. Living Dead Girl, Basket Case, New York Ripper, White Dog, The Slayer, and Tenebrae, to name just a few.
Turn it off! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
Speaking of bleak endings, there always seems to be a couple post-apocalyptic films every year. Some more in line with horror as Charlie Band's 3D monster flick from AFCO Embassy, Parasite, where a desperate man with a dangerous parasite is running from an evil corporation who is controlling the country. Our parasitic caravan ends up running into a group of people, which include Debbie Moore in her screen debut. A group of punks including Ghoulies director Luca Bercovici and Tom Villard give our unconventional lead a hard time, and soon enough our parasite creature attacks. Parasite features good special effects from Stan Winston and one great kill involving a washed-up actress. The Aftermath by Steve Barkett is an independent, violent vanity project starring the director and his son, along with Sid Haig as the leader of a gang of ruthless scavengers and famous Monsters creator Roy J. Ackerman. The Aftermath comes across completely sincere, and it's well done on a budget, with plenty of action, fighting, a few mutants, and some of the director's personal beliefs done via narration. The Aftermath done by someone with less heart and sincerity would come across as an embarrassing exploitation cheapie, but instead this comes across as something to admire. Cafe Flash is an adult film where the world has been divided into two categories, sex positives and sex negatives. The negatives force the positives to perform for them on stage, as they themselves get violently ill when they commit the act. Much better than a lot of its contemporary adult films at the time, it features some bizarre characters, nice set designs, and an intriguing enough story. Again, I'll briefly mention the Ennio G. Castellari picture, 1990, The Bronx Warriors, as it started a trend in Italian cinema where Castellari would do a sequel the following year, and another film in the same vein. And within 5 years, genre directors Joe D'Amato, Bruno Mattei, Sergio Martino, Ruggero Deodato, Lucio Fulci, and Antonio Margheriti would all do at least one. Science fiction and horror often go hand in hand. Scientific creations, threats in space or from beyond the stars, end-of-the-world mutations, these plot points make it easier to include these in the horror category. But there are a few that fit more in line with your just good old science fiction categories, or are mixed with other genres. The Mysterious 2, for example, is another film like Time Walker, made to be a TV pilot, but was later turned into a movie. Gary Sherman, director of Dead and Buried and this year's Vice Squad, directs. Has an interesting cult-like Messiah angle and a decent cast, but it feels uncompleted due to the previously mentioned origin. Liquid Sky is directed by Salva Sukerman, who was born in the Soviet Union. Soviet science fiction films tend to have their own unique flavor, doesn't often translate quite easily to the Western audience, although many of which are incredibly compelling films. Being filmed in New York and the punk drug scene, that aesthetic also comes through, making for one of the weirdest, most surreal combinations. Anne Carlisle plays dual roles, one male and one female, adding to the unique quality. Before long, Carlisle's female counterpart in the film realizes that everyone she has a sexual encounter with disappears. The culprit is some tiny alien invaders looking for the ultimate drug sex endorphins mixed with heroin. Also playing as a rape revenger thriller, it's no wonder that Liquid Sky became a huge cult item. Android is another New World Picture film that takes place in space, but unlike Forbidden World, there is no alien danger. Klaus Kinski and Don Upper are a pair of researchers isolated in space, studying an android, when a trio of fugitives interrupt and spells danger. Android is a pretty solid science fiction flick that takes a look at artificial life and even manages to pack a nice little twist at the end. Ulay Lamel directed the science fiction thriller Brainwaves after his 1980 film The Boogeyman, and before the Devonsville Terror in 1983. Actor Keir Dulloo's daughter gets in a car accident. A doctor played by Tony Curtis tries a new procedure where they use someone else's brain waves to stimulate her brain. The new brain waves are from a murder victim, and it's up to our recovering patient to try to figure out who the murderer is. Similar to something like 27 Hours of the Dead from this year in the sense that it really should be about 30 minutes long, but ended up being feature-length. Crosstalk is an Aussie take on Rear Window. The year previous, The Land of the Long Weekend put out Road Games, another take on a Hitchcock film. When a man working on a supercomputer is temporarily confined to a wheelchair, his CPU records a murder. The computer and himself become focused on solving this murder. Of course, no one believes him. A solid science fiction thriller with a head in a bag to spare. Endangered Species starts off in what seems like an alien cattle mutilation film, but quickly turns into a conspiracy-style thriller. A city cop, played by Robert Urich, and his estranged daughter get involved with a female sheriff, Jo Beth Williams, from Poltergeist to solve the strange mutilations. The leads are good, as is Paul Dooley as a reporter, Peter Coyote as a good antithesis to his character from E.T., and Hoyt Axton as a self-proclaimed patriot.
I'm American!
Every country has their share of exploitation films in 1982. Italy was infamous for taking popular films of the time and cashing in successfully. In the 50s, they had Peplum, 60s, they had Westerns, 70s, they had Giallo and Polizieschi. By the 80s, they had zombies, women in prison flicks, and post-apocalyptic films. One of the weirdest trends was the period piece sex films they would make, filled with violence and taboos due to the success of Caligula in 1979 by Tinto Brass. Although not necessarily a ripoff from another country, as the movie was partially made in Italy. Folks like Joe D'Amato and Bruno Mattei would make all sorts of depraved sleaze and unofficial sequels like Caligula, The Untold Story, and Nero, and Pupaya, An Orgy of Power. Already mentioned was the huge subgenre of exploitation films, which have their own flavor. Not all bleed into the horror category, but with Turkey Shoot's extreme violence, I would say it pushes it there. Steve Railsback plays an unconventional lead. Along with Olivia Hussey, the duo must survive a game of death in the vein of The Most Dangerous Game, where a group of eccentric elites hunt prisoners in an isolated location. Turkey Shoot features some of the best baddies of the year, including Roger Ward, Michael Craig, Carmen Duncan, and a genetically modified beastman who chews off appendages on command. A few American films in this subgenre not yet explored would be Vice Squad, a sleazy LA movie to counter all the New York grit from this year. Wings Hauser steals this film as a pimp named Ramrod, who violently stalks an undercover prostitute. Wings is scary and unrelenting. The stuff with him is great, but the rest of the film seems a tad uneven and almost inappropriately silly. A subgenre within exploitation that is explored immensely is the rape revenge genre. At times, it's not the entirety of the film, but used as a plot device or a catalyst for the final act of vengeance. Class of 1984 follows this suit. In 1974, the Charles Bronson film Death Wish was a huge hit worldwide. Michael Winner directed a sequel in '82. While the first film was an intelligent look at vigilantism where a mild-mannered architect decides to wander the streets and kill any criminals he encounters, with a nice little look at how the media reacts, as well as the populace, the sequel is not so much that. Michael Winner, Bronson, and Vincent Gardenia return. Bronson no longer is stalking the streets of New York, but now he is in LA, where his loved ones are once again attacked. The attacks are brutal and much more exploitative than the first film. This time around, Bronson actually finds the right perpetrators, and violence, of course, ensues. Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin turns in a fantastic score with plenty of heavy guitar riffs, and it's worth noting there's an early role for Lawrence Fishburne. 3 more sequels would follow, and seemingly get more over the top as they continued. Part 2 is the right middle ground for fans of exploitation and something a bit more grounded. The film Vigilante is more in the vein of the first Death Wish film, and Fighting Back, also from 1982. William Lustig is no stranger to exploitation flair, and we have plenty of disturbing moments. Vigilante sports a good cast and makes for a solid follow-up to his 1980 film, Maniac. You can't go wrong with Robert Forster, Fred Williamson, Joe Spinell, Richard Bright, Britannia Alda. Exploitation is another carryover from mostly 70s films, where our city folk end up running afoul of a small town or backwoods residents and have to fight for their life. William Fruit's Trapped is exactly that, but with a bit more nuance than some of its predecessors. William Fruit is somewhat of an underrated director, putting out solid genre fare such as Death Weekend, Killer Party, and Blue Monkey, among a couple more 80s horrors as well, such as Funeral Home, 1980, and Spasms, 1983. Deadly Sunday, directed by Donald M. Jones, not to be confused with Don Jones of The Forest fame, is more of a thriller film. A group of criminals take some hostages, including a family, at an isolated roadside diner. The best part of the film is actor Eli Rich, uncredited in his role, as one of the criminals. He would later go on to star in Murder Lust as a serial killer from the same director. Women in prison flicks are a pretty huge part of the exploitation subgenre. Whether it's Violence in a Women's Prison from Bruno Mattei, which attempts to break every taboo as he often did, or something from the good old USA like The Sleazy Concrete Jungle, done by porn and horror director Tom DeSimone, who did Hell Night the year before. Featuring a lot of what is expected in the subgenre, including women fights and rape from guards. Overall, this one is pretty decent for its subgenre, and has some horror royalty in it, such as Camille Keaton. Moving past exploitation into the films listed as adult horror or adult horror adjacent on Internet Movie Database. We will mention a couple that have been briefly talked about. Cafe Flesh by Steven Sayedian, who would later go on to direct Dr. Caligari, and Satan's Baby Doll. Both of these could, and Satan's Baby Doll does actually work without the sex. Mario Bianchi also directed Funny Frankenstein this year, much more of an adult comedy horror film than horror. It does star Aldo Soundbrawl from the Leonia Spaghetti Westerns and Satan's Baby Doll, as well as Mark Shannon. Funny Frankenstein features some surprising needle drops and some nonsense hijinks, as a pair of reporters end up trying to show up to a sexy party at a haunted castle. The most memorable scene in the movie is when a prostitute makes Aldo dress in a pair of woman's panties. The other Italian horror film this year is The Babysitter, directed by Alberto Calvanlone, director of Blowjob 1980. Blowjob is a much better film. The Babysitter follows the exploits of a small person who sexually tortures a babysitter. The final act is watchable enough, but before long the entire film is repetitive, sloppy blowjobs. Has multiple cuts, but after you see one, the likelihood of you wanting to see the others is null. Phil Prince directed his films out of New York. The accents are thick and the cast unconventional when one thinks of porn. These fit into the roughies category, where sex is mixed often with violence and rape. The Taming of Rebecca is his most infamous, where a group of youths are sexually assaulted at a school of runaways. Well, not before they have an orgy among their fellow teens. Worth noting is that adult film star Sharon Mitchell, who stars in the titular role, made an appearance in Lustig's Maniac. Most of Prince's scores are lifted directly from popular films like Halloween or even The Thing. The story of Prunella follows a group of ex-cons who go on a sexual assault spree, while a pair of bumbling cops, one played by Ron Jeremy, attempt to get back to their loved ones before the gang gets to them. The final Prince film is an anthology entitled Tales of the Bizarre, where a group of women chat about their most deviant sexual experiences. They seem to be enjoying them in conversation, but the flashbacks are filled with violent sex and the threat of unwanted anal intercourse. Actor George Payne is probably the biggest standout of these actors for these films, as his demented and intense performances come across equal parts hammy and unnerving. House of Sin by Carter Stevens is another New York porn film where a woman's car breaks down and she ends up being picked up by Robert Kerman from Cannibal Holocaust fame and brought back to the House of Sin, where it seems Kerman has a cult of strange people who partake in sexual intercourse at his will. rather dull and by the numbers, but with a slight horror edge. Along with Satan's Baby Doll and Cafe Flash, The Devil and Miss Jones 2 is the best of the bunch. Miss Jones ends up in hell, and the entire hierarchy is thrown into turmoil when Lucy, that's short for Lucifer, falls in love with Justine Jones. The devil must fulfill a prophecy he has made after a sexual favor, and gives her a chance at a second life. Lucifer begins to grow jealous and keeps switching Jones from body to body in hopes that her sexual exploits will end. The wordplay is funny, the filmmaking is solid, and the cast is good too. With Robert Kerman, Georgina Spelvin, Jack Wrangler, Ron Jeremy, and George Payne again. We have a slew of TV titles, most of them already mentioned within our categories. For the ones that aren't, we have Deadly Encounter, which stars Larry Hagman as a helicopter pilot, caught up trying to save an ex-lover from a group of criminals. The chopper stunts and the back and forth between Hagman and Ospa are good, but this shouldn't be listed as a horror film. Mazes and Monsters is an awful TV film starring a young Tom Hanks about the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons. It feels like a lame scare tactic and is a rather tedious and dull film. Cry for the Strangers is directed by Peter Maddock, who did 1980's The Changeling. It opens up with a couple being killed and buried in the stand neck deep. Years later, a doctor and his family move into the same house where the murder took place. After every storm, a body is discovered. The victims targeted are non-locals. Brian Keith plays a town sheriff in a decent performance. Wait Until Dark is a videotape production of a stage play starring Stacy Keach as our lead baddie and Katharine Ross as our blind protagonist. The acting from all parties included is well done, but Keach really goes wild. His run through the early 80s in genre cinema should be applauded. The Ninth Configuration in 1980, Road Games in 81, and Wait Until Dark in 1982. In a similar vein, Sweeney Todd, Demon Barber Fleet Street is a recorded version of a stage musical. The music is great, as is the stage direction, but the story, lyrics, and performances are what stand out, with Angela Lansbury and George Hearn as the Demon Barber, one of the best revenge stories around.
To seek revenge may lead to hell.
Not everyone does it, and seldom as well.
As Sweeney Todd. But in another Fleet Street.
There are a few titles that are horror adjacent that don't quite fit with any other category. After a failed debut film with Private Parts, director-actor Paul Bartel joined the School of Corman, making cult films like Death Race 2000 and Cannonball. With Death Race 2000, he added his own sense of dark humor, but wanted to get away from making car films and make his own project. When Corman refused to fund his film Eating Raoul, he decided to take a chance. Bringing along his on-screen film partner Mary Warnoff, he made one of the best black comedies around. Mary and Paul Bland, after dealing with what they consider the dregs of society, a bunch of swinging neighbors, decide they will do anything to make their dream of running/owning their own restaurant come true. When Paul and Mary kill one of the swingers on accident, they soon meet a hot-blooded emotional Chicano who offers to get rid of the bodies for profit. Eating Raoul feels like a 50s sitcom with obvious satire. The absolute ridiculous concept of a married couple that are so uptight about sex, but are willing to murder for profit is pretty genius when you compare it to the 80s greed message and the play on the 50s repressed television characters. Runaway Nightmare was made as a comedy at first, but later sold as a thriller horror. A couple worm farmers are kidnapped by a gang of women and end up helping them take on the mafia. The movie is edited poorly and seemingly patched together. For such an exploitation-sounding plot, it's pretty clean. The sword and sorcery genre was picking up again in the 80s, with films like Excalibur, Hawk the Slayer, and Clash of the Titans. Low-budget director Albert Pune made his directorial debut with The Sword and the Sorcerer. Oftentimes listed as horror, it's not much more horror than Conan the Barbarian from 1982. It does include a warlock played by Richard Mole in a cool performance, and it also includes Richard Lynch as the baddie, who is always great. Albert Pune started his career with a hit making 4 times its budget, and even spawning a somewhat unrelated toy line. The film does suffer a bit from a lot of Pune's typical issues, in that it does at times feel inept, but the action never slows and a 3-bladed sword is memorable. It's worth seeking out for fans of the genre. Even genre fave director Don Coscarelli from Phantasm fame directed a sword and sorcery film, with The Beastmaster, starring Mark Singer, John Amos, Tanya Roberts, Rip Torn, and a slew of animal friends. Although it's not quite as good as Conan from this year, and Coscarelli had a terrible time making it, it's still a vastly enjoyable film that gained cult status. Partly due to its seemingly permanent spot on HBO's movie roster, it spawned 2 sequels, and thinking about it in hindsight, I should have really mentioned Don Coscarelli much earlier, perhaps in the opening, as he is a much important figure in the horror world. While we're on the subject of sword and sorcery movies, we also should mention that Joe Diamano directed one with Ator the Fighting Eagle, which, although is not quite as good as Beastmaster, it did spawn its own wacky, weird franchise as well. With the popularity of video stores rising, we have the aisles littered with stuff from the big screen, and soon enough we'll have hundreds of direct-to-video films including a slew of SOV. But something else that was happening in the 80s were the compilation tapes. Charles Band was of course ahead of the curve and had the Best of Sex and Violence made, directed by Ken Dixon in 1981. At one point, listed as 82. This featured John Carradine as a host, making smart comments about the clips from several exploitation and horror films. The following year, Wizard Video would put out a follow-up, Famous TNA, which included many of the same films featured, but this time Sybil Danning was the host. Universal did theirs with much more finesse, getting John Landis to direct and Jamie Lee Curtis to host, who had become quite the scream queen at the time. Because of this pairing, Landis and Curtis would go on to work together on Trading Places. Coming Soon features clips from classic series such as Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein. Through the 80s, there would be several more of these, including Terror on Tape and Terror in the Isles. Talking about 1982 wouldn't be complete without mentioning the immense amount of shorts that came out this year. The professional levels range immensely, but you will notice a lot of do-it-yourself, no-budget films made by teens, like Halloween 4, Dawn of the Dreary. It's a super short fan film that brings Michael Myers back. The Terror of the Goonie Monster, sort of a quick take on the Patterson Gremlin film, too short and cheap to do much. The Big Greenhouse on the corner, inspired by Texas Chainsaw, featuring a bit of gore. Dracula vs. Demon, a no-budget SOB from UK running about 20 minutes. The title explains it all. And Leather Poltergeist, a bizarre sort of cruising gay-inspired haunting. We also have the previously mentioned Toxic Slime Creatures. It's a bit longer, but has a similar cheap quality feel to these films. Many of the shorts were actually animation from all around the globe. These have a better return on investment than the previously mentioned movies. Rusty House from Japan has great style and transitions. Dreamlight Express is haunting and surreal. Malice in Wonderland is trippy and slightly unnerving. Dance Macabre features a cute ghost and his friends dancing while trying to avoid Satan as he eats them for snacks. Manicula is a family-friendly TV broadcast adaptation of the children's book. A witch drum follows a cursed man dragging a body that comes to life. And director Jan Svankmajer explores the take on the fall of the House of Usher via stop motion. While the short Ravishing of Frankenstein puts a photo together piece by piece in grueling detail. But the best animated short of the year is Tim Burton's Vincent. A young boy obsessed with Vincent Price loses himself in his own mind with wonderful stop motion and a glimpse at some of his later talents. There's always the shorts that mostly focus on art and experimental as well. Memories of a Seaside is a Japanese short that has blurred images and maybe includes real self-harm. The act of seeing with one's own eyes is an extreme film, roughly 8 minutes long, loud noises and disgusting gore. The Pledge is a UK short, shot fantastically well about a group of criminals who decide to do the right thing and bury a hanging body. Johnny Yes No is a bit of an experimental film noir, music is the highlight. Dance of the Dead is a short music video with Lydia Lunch and baby dolls. Specimens is a film by Roy Spence about aliens and daydreaming, with plenty of cool low-budget effects. The Dummy actually got airtime on HBO between films. It's surprisingly low budget, but it most certainly traumatized many kids. Larry Fessenden directs a short vampire flick, Habit, which he would turn into a feature in 1995. This one stars Larry in the lead role as well and fits his particular style. Based on the Stephen King short story from the Night Shift collection, The Boogeyman is the first dollar baby made from King's work. It's low budget but manages to create a bit of unsettling atmosphere, and the lead performance from our haunted man is good. From American movie fame, Mark Borchardt creates a short about someone blowing up, amply titled I Blow Up. Coffin Souza directs his first short, and Satanicus, later made into a film as well. Fabio Salinero directs a 45-minute short love letter to the likes of Dario Argento with plenty of lighting and nightmare logic that pays homage. Not to mention, completely lifts the score from Goblin. Robo Macabro, from the director of 27 Hours of the Dead, Jairo Pinilla, directs a 10-minute short horror comedy that uses the same graveyard as his other film this year. Lastly, already mentioned, Jörg Buckarett directs a comedy about Hitler's last days entitled Bloody Excess in a Leader's Bunker, where Hitler creates a Frankenstein monster that tears him from limb. No matter how hard you dig and pull resources, there are always going to be a couple films without English-friendly options, films that are lost and possibly or missed. These are a few I think are worth noting from some research. First up are a few Brazilian films without English options. Castle of de Sade, where it appears some students end up in the hands of the spirit of Marquise de Sade. The Night of Terrors 2, Seems to be a horse sex anthology, which Brazil had a few from the year previous, one story involving a serial killer. Dinner of Sexual Desire seems to be more softcore horror hybrid, again in lines with the films that Brazil was doing. The plot seems interesting on this one, with stuff about descendants of Dracula and sacrifices. Setan Kredit seems to be an Indonesian comedy horror, where a group of idiots face off against a ghost. The White Crocodile is another Indonesian flick about an evil disguised as a crocodile. Les Pros des Morts is a French film with a runtime listed of nearly 3 hours, where nursing home residents must face a satanic evil. This one is seemingly impossible to find. There is a couple adult films as well. An Italian one titled Orgasmo Istico, and a French film, Corpsicese. Another, an Italian horror spoof, Di Spacco il Muso Bimba, which seems to be a giallo spoof as well. And there are numerous ones where the quality was so poor, it was even counterproductive to watch. The Fairy of the Devil, which seemed to be more of a kaiju film, The Hell from Taiwan, the South Korean film, Three Women's Rancor, which showed promise but no subtitles would work, and countless others that may have inaccuracies in genre or release date. As we move through the 80s, there are always going to be titles that are missed or the release dates change. When I started this 1980s journey, Satan Slays by Indonesia's most prolific horror director was listed as 1982. The date later changed to 1980, somewhat changing my understanding of the timeline of horror. Siswara Gunamaputra directed 3 horror films from 1981, The Warrior, Ghost with Hole, and Wolf. He also directed 2 from 1982, the beginning of his trilogy The Snake Queen and the fantasy Sang Karang. Satan's Slave actually was made before these, and it's one of his best films. It's about a family suffering the loss of their mother. They are attacked by evil due to their lax faith, filled with plenty of spooky graveyard atmosphere and creatures from beyond. Blood Bride was another film that was listed as 82 when I started and changed to 1980 due to its debut at the Cannes Film Festival. Blood Bride would have fit in with other marital horrors from 82, including Till Death Do We Part, Honeymoon Horror, and Till Death Do We Scare. But since it's 1980, that changes some things. A secretary without much luck in dating falls in love with a mysterious man with some sexual perversions involving nuns. Of course, this stemmed from something that happened early in life. A relatively mediocre film with a decent performance from our lead's father, who is constantly badgering her to get married. The director would later go on to work with Brian De Palma. I should also mention, Death Valley, while making this, has switched to 81, and Escapees by John Rowland has jumped to 1982, previously being 1981. I will quickly brush over the odd South African supernatural slasher, The Demon, as its date changes often from 1979 to 82. Currently, the date sits at 1979, but that may change. Cameron Mitchell in the film investigates a series of strange murders. The film starts off with promise, but soon loses its steam as our most interesting character exits. This is worth noting because it does have a supernatural slasher aspect. The last film I will talk about is Golem from 1980, a Polish film directed by Peter Szelkin, who did a series of science fiction films that often bleed into other genres. Golem is a post-apocalyptic film. Visually, it's depressing and gloomy with themes of possible mistaken identity and government secrets. It's well done and fairly haunting. Before we get into the top 25 horror films, let's take a moment to list the best horror-adjacent films of the year. Conan the Barbarian. John Milius directs the adaptation from the DC comic line, the movie that put Arnie on the map. James Earl Jones plays a great villain, King of the Snake Men. It features one of the best scores of the year, by Basil Podorres. Conan sits on top of the broken skulls of fellow fantasy film contemporaries. Not a horror film, but a future inspiration to a few. The Hatter's Ghost. Claude Chabrol proves why he is one of France's finest directors with this beautifully clever, darkly funny serial killer film. Small town atmosphere is exceptional, and our character motives, although fairly nuanced, are achieved. Liquid Sky. Punk rock, hardcore drugs, revenge, neon lights, and aliens. Not exactly the most straightforward film, but the weirdness and aesthetics sure make for a memorable viewing experience. Vigilante. In a year filled with vigilantism, it's only right that the Lustig film gets a special mention. Jay Chataway does a fitting score, and he often goes unmentioned wrongfully. Enjoyable Forrester and Williamson back-and-forth dialogue, great foot chases, and influential scenes that seemingly got lifted. The only downside is the somewhat lackluster ending. Death Wish 2. Charles Bronson delivers one of his best one-liners ever.
You believe in Jesus? Yes, I do. Well, you're going to meet him.
Not only is Bronson entertaining to watch, but the villains are as well. They are obnoxious and distinctive. The best of the sequels, and maybe even crazy enough to surpass the first film.
Goodbye.
Eating Raoul. Paul Bartel and Mary Warnoff make it easy to cheer on a pair of murdering uptight snobs, no matter how awful they seem to get. The quirky sense of humor and non-PC jokes might not age well for everyone, but they are often done in such a lighthearted way it's hard to take any of it offensive. Although for some it might make it more so. Eating Raoul has everything you'd want in a black comedy. Cannibalism, murder, and a never-ending cavalcade of soon-to-be dog food kinky swingers.
Swing on weekend! Oh, yeah? Well, swing on this.
Class of 1984. Is this the future?
Take a look at my face. I belong to the future. And the world belongs to me. Take a look at my...
Taking place just 2 years in the future, screenwriter Tom Holland and director Mark Lester must not have had much faith in the future of schools when they made this teacher versus high school punks vigilante gang movie. I Am the Future by Alice Cooper blast over the soundtrack, asking the audience, when does a dream become a nightmare? Well, for new teacher Andrew Norris, rather quickly, as he has to deal with a quintet of vicious punks that run the school with an iron fist, each with their own specialty. The final confrontation is intense and violent, following suit with the films at the time. The best kids versus teacher flick ever, and one great one for Mark Lester. Before we get into the top 25, I have some notable snubs, honorable mentions, and a newly suggested category, Hidden Gems. Although I've managed to mention every movie I have watched for my journey into 1982 in this video, I'd like to put a spotlight on some movies I love, or maybe that you love, or maybe you just need a special push to check them out. Notable snubs. The House on Sorority Row. An enjoyable slasher film with a good core group of characters and a couple memorable kills. Head and Toilet, anyone? Distributed by Film Ventures, ran by the controversial Edward L. Montaro, who disappeared a couple years later. The score by Richard Band is one of his best and biggest, and a highlight of the film. It's the debut of director Mark Rossman, who would go on to direct a killer robot flick, Involver. A good film with memorable set pieces, but just not a personal favorite. Swamp Thing. Director Wes Craven does an early comic book adaptation, and even manages to use the 60s styles transitions to keep it a bit campy. Being filmed on an actual swamp also helps with the atmosphere. A fantastic cast with genre faves, and David Hess, Nicholas Worth, Adrian Barbeau, Ray Wise, and Ricardo Montalban as the evil Arcane. It's hard to include this on a top horror list as it has some horror flavor, but it's never quite felt like one. For years I had always thought that Swamp Thing was a dud, but with repeated viewings it became a film I had some love for. This film was partially responsible for the sequel, of course, a live-action TV series, a toy line, and a cartoon series. Forbidden World, a fun and absolutely bonkers film. This time around, the film finally connected with me after having some context. Done purposely more so as a comedy than I originally had thought, so maybe over time Forbidden World will grow for me like the cancerous tumor does in the film. Vice Squad. Director Gary Sherman is a bit underrated. Starting his directing career with Deathline, starring the wonderful Donna Pleasance in 1972, he moved on to do one of my favorite films in Dead Buried in 81. So when it came time to watch Vice Squad, I was quite excited. Although listed as a horror film, I figured it was more in line with exploitation, but that was fine. I felt the film to be a fairly underwhelming experience. I enjoyed the shots of Los Angeles sleaze. They worked fine enough, and Wings is amazing as our villain, but the uneven tone and the lead police officer fell completely flat, and the attempts at comedy were poor.
Blue Star presents Boarding House.
Boarding House. Certainly a memorable movie, and under the right circumstances for myself, I could see a major love developing for this one. But as it stands now, I think it's just a little too crazy and all over the place to include in my top 25. A great early look at what we would eventually get in the 80s with all the SOV madness. Superstition. A gory witch story movie that starts off really well with good kills and ends with a couple iconic shots. But there is a law in the film where it seems that they may have run out of money. Overall, a witch who resides in a swamp and comes to kill the residents of the nearby house is a cool concept, and almost works for me as a whole, but it doesn't quite get there. Deadly Eyes, a fun eco-horror flick based on the book Rats, which was featured in the book Paperbacks from Hell. a book focusing on the wild and weird horror novels of the 70s and 80s. The Deadly Eyes climax is a blast with a horde of dogs dressed as rats. Enjoyable film, but not enough to make it to the tops.
Don't have the jaw pressure to stab through those metacarpals that cleanly.
Would you believe the other day I saw a rat this big?
Are you through?
No, I mean it. He was this big.
One Dark Night. Tom McLaughlin directs the telekinetic nightmare from beyond the grave, with solid atmosphere and a good location. Following the classic trope of staying overnight in a scary place as a dare, it has a sense of adolescent fun. Made with Mormon money, it's shockingly gross in scenes, yet lacks nudity or sex. The early one-shot setting up our villain Raymar works excellent, as does the pile of corpses falling on her screaming sorority sisters in the climax, but the middle part of the film is paced too slow to make the top of the list. But it deserves a mention, as I believe it is a film of importance, and there's an early role for Meg Tilly. Manhattan Baby. Fulci manages to create a good atmosphere and an interesting catalyst for our supernatural happenings in one of two of his films from '82. Manhattan Baby delivers on a lot of the goods we expect of the time from the maestro, including close-ups of eyes, an unknown strange evil, and a great story done by Fabio Frizzi. It does lack the gore that has become synonymous with his work, and its reputation has suffered for it. But if you can go in blind, like Christopher Connolly in the film, with no preconceived notions, it's an enjoyable horror with some cool Egyptian iconography, yet still not quite good enough for an honorable mention. Visiting Hours. Ironside is fantastic, and the psychological aspects are fairly interesting, but at times Visiting Hours seems to be a tad repetitive, and maybe feels a bit too grounded in some aspects to ever pick up enough to be great. Still a good sleazy slasher serial killer entry, which is a bit more thought-provoking than its contemporaries, especially that it had such a big mainstream push and was everywhere. As a bit of a cheat, I'm introducing another category, Hidden Gems. I'm sure some of these movies will grow in popularity as they become more available, but for now I feel these are all very good horror films that are worthy of honorable mentions but don't seem to be nearly as popular, most likely due to availability. We will try and be brief, as most of these films have been mentioned to a certain extent. Hidden Gems. Pure Blood. A literal rich feed off the poor story, obvious yet effective and well done. A trio of criminals are blackmailed to getting blood for a dying rich old man who needs it to survive. Homosexuals and children become the victims as they are picked up off the streets of Colombia and drained of their blood. Some of the scenes are long and drawn out, adding to the disturbing factor. The Appointment. Creepy premonitions, nightmares, and a great look at subtle supernatural abilities. That could qualify this film as an evil children's film as well. Probably sports the scariest car wreck ever. It's so drawn out that it feels as if the audience is actually in the nightmare. Good performance from Edward Woodward as well. Cute Devil. A TV effort from Japan by the creator of Houseu and School and Crosshairs '81, focus on an evil little girl and a young woman who both might have supernatural abilities. Working part as Japan's remake to The Bad Seed, with some element of Carrie, it works incredibly well, with a tragic ending. Double Exposure, a sweaty psychological thriller slasher film with plenty of nudity and murder. Michael Callan gives an unhinged performance as he begins to struggle with nightmares of murder and mayhem that seemingly come true. By the end of the film, they give two possible options, and although it's not the most original film, it has some sleazy POV action, and it's genuinely unnerving. Woman of Fire, '82. Another remake on the Hidden Gems list follows a story of infidelity and class warfare within the same household. The third-time director Kim Kai-young has done this story. Opening up with a pair of cops investigating a couple of murders on a farm, we as the audience learn quickly, not everything is as it seems. South Korea has many horror and thriller stories that stem from paranoia and infidelity. Women of Fire '82 is of course one. It works so well due to the manipulation tactics of its characters, the tragedy, a feeling of claustrophobia within the farm, and a true feeling of guilt. Lullaby of Death. Director Yasuyo Matsumura goes out with a fantastic thriller mystery horror, where each piece of the puzzle that finds its place reveals another tragedy. A great untypical revenge story that is a bit convoluted, but the journey and reveal is so satisfying that the emotional finale is worth the investment. A great cast and interesting characters carry this story along. The Dead and Deadly. Sammo Hung plays a lovable loser who gets involved in some crazy inheritance scheme that turns into murder. Bright colored and fun lighting with plenty of ghost action. Sammo Hung has some solid fight scenes, but the last act seals the deal. Calamity of Snakes. When a snake pit is uncovered in the construction of a new luxury apartment building, they are killed without remorse. Soon a giant boa constrictor along with hundreds of venomous snakes begin to kill anyone involved with the construction of the building, featuring a kung fu fight scene where a man takes down a snake and one of the craziest finales of any animal attacks film ever made. Unfortunately, Calamity of Snakes includes an uncountable amount of real-life animal violence. Burned at the stake, Mr. Big, or Burt-I Gordon, known for his giant killer animals in horror flicks of the 70s and before, directs a reincarnation time-jumping witch story. Reincarnation seems to be quite popular subgenre in the early 80s. The film includes gory flashbacks of tortures that involve our characters switching timelines with each other. Gordon delivers some well-thought-out concepts and ideas, including an evil witch finder in modern society. Victims, disturbing and nasty character study about an unstable man who hates women. Every encounter he has with them gets worse and worse, as the film progresses, eventually leading to his end. History seems to repeat itself in this Tony Varno directed and starring film. I Desire, a solid TV film version of Fright Night where no one believes a college student about a blood-sucking prostitute. One of the two great TV horrors of this year. Honorable mentions. Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. Sweeney Todd returns home for revenge disguised. He teams up with a local shop owner, and before long they are killing patrons and serving them in pies to the locals. Excellent recording of one of the greatest musicals of all time, written by Stephen Sondheim. I felt a little weird about including a recording of the stage play on my top 25, so I put it in the honorable mentions. The cast is fantastic: Angela Lansbury, George Hearns, Edmund Lydeck, and nearly everyone else. The lyrics are clever, dark, and funny. One of the best stories about revenge to ever be made, and fittingly tragic. Remember, attend the tale of Sweeney Todd. Black Room. Thanks to a remaster from Vinegar Syndrome, one can finally see this realistic bloodsucker film about a sex addict who unknowingly supplies victims to a voyeuristic serial killer brother and sister who need blood. When the sex addict's wife realizes what her husband is doing, she decides she might want to use his black room as well. A lot of nice camera work is on display here, including steadicam shots and long oneers. Norman Thaddeus Vane is listed as a co-director, but the film's other director, Ely Kenner, claims it was only done for contract obligations. Death Valley. A great cast star in this Rear Window style horror film. A young boy, Billy, witnesses a murder. Unknowingly, this motivates our killer to tie up loose ends. The Death Valley location is a good backdrop, and the casting of Ralphie from Christmas Story adds an extra element of fear. Death Valley takes its time giving its supporting characters a moment or two so that not only do we fear for Billy, but we actually mourn the loss of side characters. Midnight. Regional low-budget quality satanic cult slasher film directed by John Russo. Highlighted are some rustic and wooded areas of Pennsylvania. The Aftermath. Written, directed, and starring all in front of the same name isn't usually the signs of a quality low-budget film, without sarcasm being involved. But Steve Barkett manages to make this film work. A good violent action horror about survival in a post-nuclear world. Night Beast. The most mainstream film the Baltimore native Don Dohler ever made. Plenty of alien action, a high body count, a rad alien, and some awkward nudity and sex. Amityville 2, The Possession. The rare occasion where I think the sequel actually surpasses the original. The peculiar mix of styles, countries, and people involved make for a memorable and great film, even if the final act is a little too similar to The Exorcist.
Mister, this isn't your business, you hear that? I raise my children the way I see fit. Now you do what you gotta do and go.
The last horror film. Joe Spinell and Carolyn Monroe reunite for this bizarre follow-up to Maniac. A New York cabbie with the dreams of making a film with a famous starlet stalks her at the Cannes Film Festival. Soon, a bunch of bodies begin to pile up. Watching Spinell running around the Cannes Film Festival is a blast to watch. The kills are gory, and the meta ending where Spinell acts alongside his real-life mother is endearing. X-Row. Equal parts frightening and confusing. Each time we settle into a weird story, something else seems to happen. Alien abduction, to superpowered children, to slasher, to family drama, back to aliens, and forever in the bonkers category. Don't go to sleep. Dennis Weaver, Ruth Gordon, and Oliver Robbins from Poltergeist are among the cast of this TV ghost story about revenge from beyond the grave. Much more dark and disturbing than one would expect. White Dog. Although listed as horror in many places, I always felt that White Dog belonged more in the adjacent category. An excellent film, which gets its point across poignantly. Let's move on to the top 25 films of the year. Number 25.
Cat People, rated R.
A good sexual update on the classic Val Lewton-produced 40s film, Cat People features daughter of Klaus Kinski, Natasha Kinski, in a provocative role as one of the two remaining cat people, an old incestuous race of creatures that mate with their siblings. Malcolm McDowell plays her brother, who has been residing in Louisiana partaking in casual sex, followed by feline murder. When Kinski finally comes to meet her estranged brother, she gets into a relationship with the zookeeper, John Hurd, who soon becomes obsessed with the exotic and dangerous Kinski. Director Paul Schrader and composer Giorgio Moroder continued their partnership, which proves to be a fruitful collaboration. A very intelligent and often thought-provoking update, with good effects and a great atmosphere. '24.
The Slayer.
Low methodical pace, memorizing and haunting, with a great foreboding atmosphere. Shot on Tybee Island in the winter makes for a great isolated and empty nightmarescape. J.S. Cardone brings in a lot of unique and unnerving concepts about premonitions and dreams that seem ahead of their time.
Santa Claus sure must have liked those cookies you left, because he sure did bring you a special gift. Merry Christmas, Kay.
Number 23.
The Slumber Party Massacre.
Super fast-paced, wildly entertaining slasher with a slice of camp for those that are looking. Director Amy Holden Jones seems to make this film work from her direction. It really makes the difference, because on paper this film is pretty run-of-the-mill. Mentally ill killer breaks out and targets a group of girls, sporting all the standard tropes. Shower scene, babysitters, horny boyfriends, you get it. But she manages to make this funny and clever.
Well, life goes on after all, and eating makes me feel best. When I feel bad, and boy, do I feel bad. Oh.
Number 22. Next of Kin. Psychological inheritance horror mixed with mysterious deaths at a home for geriatrics. A great backdrop for our lead character to dig into her mother's haunted past while dealing with current string of tragic mishaps that may be related. The camera work is a highlight, as is our final reveal, and an amazing accident of a final shot. Well made, overall mixing in a lot of real fears that many people have. Number 21.
The Beast Within.
I Was a Teenage Cicada Man. Puberty horror at its sleaziest. An inherited revenge story taking place in a small southern town features a slew of great potential victims, played by a haggle of character actors, with your classic 80s bladder effects and a bit of the 70s grindhouse mentality. Number 20.
The Entity.
Based on allegorical account, The Entity never worked for me until this time around. I always felt that Barbara Hershey gave one of the best performances in horror, but I felt the last act just sort of fell apart. And although the final act of the movie is still the weakest, The Entity works as a whole. Focusing a lot on the psychological aspects as well as the paranormal, it's a battle between two different sciences, both of which have their skeptics. Besides the amazing performance at the center, Ron Silver, Alex Rocco, and David LaBiasa all do well. But the score and sound mix are probably the next best thing in The Entity.
Hey, you can't use your hands. Come on.
Don't start without me.
Number 19. Latan. A Nightmare Premonition opens up Latan as a small village is celebrating their version of the Day of the Dead style festival. Rarely does a film capture a unique look at how a supernatural entity moves, but Latan does that wonderfully, with great set pieces and beautiful dreamlike cinematography. An isolated small village setting and strange practices including unique masks worn by our villagers give this a nice folk horror touch. Another story of reincarnation, where our villagers are slowly being overtaken by ancestors from the past, maybe more than one at a time, driving some of them mad. Number 18. Hell Has No Boundary. A woman on vacation with her boyfriend is possessed by a victim seeking revenge from the past. Bright lights, violent kills, and wartime flashbacks, along with some Shaw sleaze and magic showdown, make this one memorable. Number 17, Curse of Evil. Almost an entire family is murdered and tossed into a family well. Many years later, one of the remaining family members is killed, leaving only a handful of family members left. Soon enough, a centipede-like demon emerges, attacking and raping family members. If this isn't crazy enough, mutated metal-mouthed frogs start to take a few bites out of people as well. Insane's family curse film from the Shaw Brothers, featuring some of the most bizarre monsters from their catalog. Number 16.
Brimstone and Treacle.
A 1982 film version of a 1976 recorded play that wasn't released until after this film. Brimstone and Treacle is a dark psychological drama horror film about a scammer played by Sting who invades the lives of a married couple, Delhem Elliott and Joan Plowright. Soon he takes an interest in their paralyzed daughter. Delhem Elliott shares an absolute disdain for the world due to his guilt from an affair and other secrets he is keeping, while Joan Plowright falls under Sting's spell almost immediately, causing larger rifts between the family. The film doesn't shy away from a plethora of nasty subjects, including incest and sexual assault, featuring a couple well-done songs by Sting himself and some great acting from our trio of stars.
Look here, old son, we don't know anything about you, not the first thing. I mean, you could be the devil himself for all we know.
Only you can hear, oh God!
Number 15, Der Fan. One of the best films about fandom and obsession. Real-life teenage TV presenter Desiree Nosebush stars as a mentally ill fan that creates a fantasy world involving a famous musician within her mind. She will stop at nothing to make her fantasy a reality, but it's only a matter of time before it's all shattered. Also starring real-life musician Bobo Steiger, whose band Rheingold did the soundtrack. Number 14, Turkey Shoot. Brian Trenchard Smith manages to make a great exploitation horror film, even after he lost a huge chunk of the budget. If you take into consideration that Next of Kin came out this year as well, this probably makes for the best Aussie horror year of the 80s. A film like this needs a good group of villains to track down our desperate heroes, but it also needs a couple things that stand out and set it apart, and Turkey Shoot does just that. From the Roger Ward shadowboxing turned to beating, people being set on fire, an exploding head, and a sexually deviant crossbow-welding sadistic woman.
Sir, I am a deviant, lowest form of life on Earth. I, well known to be an asset to society. Sir,
What?
I will,
Number 13.
Poltergeist.
A fantastic suburban and family dynamic is created by Hooper and Spielberg, with great performances all around. The Goldsmith score is memorable and effective, with its childlike creepiness inserted, featuring two of the biggest kinder trauma scenes of all time, with the behemoth tree coming to life, and of course the menacing clown doll, one of the best gateway horror films ever made. Number 12.
Pieces.
Part college campus gory slasher and part whodunit giallo. Absurd in all the best ways, with a fantastic cast of genre favorites Christopher George, Linda Day George, Jack Taylor, Edwin Purdom, and Paul Smith as the most ridiculous red herring of all time. Featuring not one, but two of the best taglines of all time, and some of the best chainsaw mayhem ever.
While we were out here fumbling with that music, the lousy bastard was in there killing her! Bastard! Bastard! Bastard!
He cut that poor girl in half while she was still alive.
Number 11, Human Lanterns. The final Shaw Brothers horror on my top 25 is directed by Sun Chong. A classic revenge tale period piece where our villain pits two masters against each other, killing loved ones and planting the seeds for hatred. The sets are wonderful, the lighting is colorful, and the villain is memorable and terrifying. With an MO out of Ed Gein's playbook. The climax in our killer's lair is also fantastic. Number 10, Q the Winged Serpent.
Q is coming.
One of the kings of New York filmmaking, Larry Cohen shoots his 50s-style giant monster attacks film, Guerrilla Style, using the Chrysler Building as the climax as a great counter to King Kong's climb on the Empire State Building. Cohen manages to mix three storylines while keeping the plot fast and the dialogue sharp. David Carradine, Richard Roundtree, and the majority of the cast do great, but Moriarty steals the show with one of his best performances of the year as a low-rent piano-playing crook who blackmails the city of New York so no one else becomes lunch for an ancient Aztec lizard god in Q.
Did you actually see this?
Hey, what is this? Hey, Moskowitz, get these guys out of here. Get them out of here.
Take another photo. No, Shepard, get him back here. I want my photo out there. Come on.
This city needs me now. And get the owner of that newspaper. What's his name? Murdoch? Get Rupert down here with his arm around me. Come on, sit down.
Right. I'm gonna be on television. I'm gonna be on all the shows. Yeah. You're just jealous, Shepard. Jealous? What can I say? You know, the only way you guys get your picture in the paper is when you get shot.
Number 9.
Friday the 13th, Part 3, in 3D.
At one point said to be the last made of the series, it seems that this time around the Friday the 13th series realized what they were and sort of planted their feet. There was no way after refining and making a shit ton of money they would stop, even with the embarrassment they seemed to have from the series. Making Jason a hulking monster, giving him his signature mask, incorporating a gimmick, and adding some more production value, it really did seem to move it all up in the next step. Steve Miner returns to direct his second film of the franchise and does nearly as well with this one. Again, it gives you what you expect. Kills, sex, and probably the last great Jason chase scene in the franchise. And also not to mention a disco version by Harry Manfredini of one of our favorite slasher themes.
Get up! Shelley, enough is enough!
Number 8, Living Dead Girl. John Roland managed to mix in a great emotional core within his vampire zombie film. When a young girl is resurrected and needs blood, her closest companion provides. A classic horror story about not accepting loss, and the horrors one will do to never face grief. The film takes place in a family castle in a small village, giving it what one might think a period piece feeling at times. But it seems actually to take place in a modern world, giving it a strange quality. John Roland's famous camera work is on display in a couple long zooms, whether it's for a bathing scene or a melancholic ending shot. Number 7.
Alone in the Dark.
Jack Shoulder puts New Line Cinema on the map for horror films with this semi-slasher part home invasion flick, starring some of the best veterans turned into horror actors around. Palins, Landau, and Van Lith are part of a quartet of mental patients out for revenge against their new doctor due to their self-created delusions. Donald Pleasance also stars in a great comical role. The siege narrative works well, the riots are effective, but the villains steal the show. The callback to the punk rock concert is a great final touch.
I love him. So fucking angry. Hey, Faith. You're really there, you know? You're really there.
Number 6.
Basket case.
The ultimate New York sleaze, low-budget grit, and bad taste. Basket Case follows Dwayne, a young, naive man who travels to New York to get revenge on the doctors who separated him from his conjoined twin Belial. Dwayne carries his brother, a super strong yet incredibly deformed monster in a basket. They encounter plenty of eccentric characters, a few who don't seem to be real actors. Basket Case has to be one of the best little creature films to ever be made. Rarely does one take such a subgenre known for its silliness and put it in the world of 42nd Street crime. Charming yet imperfect stop motion works to the film's advantage, as does the interiors created for the film. I'm sure some people are still convinced that Hotel Brooklyn still stands.
Jesus Christ!
Number 5. The New York Ripper. A theme I've never noticed in Fulci's work until the help of the discussion with Troy Harworth and company is the idea that if you aren't the best, you are nothing. That plays over quite a few of Fulci's films, but is very prevalent in our killer's motivations here. The last of the real nasty films, and the last of what many consider Fulci's horror heyday, New York Ripper is by far his nastiest and his sleaziest. The quacking duck voice of the killer is an odd touch, but with the reveal works, even if people still find humor in it. Francesco Damasi turns in a good jazzy and somewhat funky score that accompanies this sort of get-off-your-feet-and-move police procedural, while also working as a good backdrop to New York. A one-off nightmare sequence is effective, and more revealing who the identity of the killer is the more you watch it. But the thing that most people take away from the New York Ripper is the brutality of the kills, which didn't go without controversy. Nipples are split, bottles are shoved in places, eyes are damaged beyond comprehension, and what many believe a hatred of women is displayed, putting the film in a place of infamy forever, and taking over most of the discussion. The New York Ripper works as a cap to Fulci's brutality, but it also just works as a giallo, as a mystery, and as a look at competitive behavior and tragedy.
Daddy, please don't leave me alone. Please. Please answer. Speak to me. Daddy, please. Please answer, Daddy.
Number 4.
Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, the night no one comes home.
Taking the franchise in a new direction, this didn't pay off, with excluding popular slasher Michael Myers. But much like The Thing from this year, Halloween 3 gained a loyal fan base over the years. A concept that is as heady as preposterous, it makes for an intriguing mystery, keeping the audience invested. As I reflect back on many of the horror films that I enjoy on repeat viewings, the investigation part of the film tends to speak to me, discovering weird and wild concepts that hurt my head as well as stimulate my brain at the same time. The score is one of Carpenter and Howarth's best, and Conal Cochran, played by Dan O'Harely, is probably the best overall villain of the year.
And happy Halloween.
Number 3.
Creep Show.
George A. Romero, Stephen King, and Tom Savini at their heights made one of the best love letters to EC Comics of the 50s. Again, I mentioned more in line with the tone and style than the great Amicus movies. Romero and company create a real-life comic from pages turning to wild bright lighting and ridiculous captions in the vein of the Batman show of the 60s. The score is beloved, but not talked about in regard as it should be, as it's one of the best of the time. The cast is one of the finest Romero ever got, and the just desserts of it all fit with the Romero mentality.
You see that crap? All that horror crap? Things coming out of crates and eating people? Dead people coming back to life? People turning into weeds, for Christ's sake?
Well, yes, I did, but I...
Well, you want them reading that stuff?
Well, no, but...
All right, then. I took care of it. That's why God made fathers, babe. That's why God made fathers.
I hope you rot in hell.
Number 2, Tenebrae. According to Argento, Tenebrae takes place in the near future, where a virus has killed a huge chunk of the population. I guess that doesn't stop the general public from partaking in author Peter Neal's murder mystery stories. Murders begin happening in Rome that uses the same killing methods as Our Killers does in Peter Neal's newest novel. When Peter Neal arrives in Rome, he is made aware of them and in traditional Argento style becomes involved in solving the case. Argento takes the time in his script to make comments about violence in art and comments about his own critics, but is playful in his approach and is most certainly thought-provoking at every step. Featuring the best camera work of the year in an amazing one-shot, a great score by basically Goblin, a slew of transgressive touches, and maybe even some self-reflection that doesn't forget to have some fun, Tenebrae is the maestro's finest work, and like Troy Howarth says, one of the final punches in the giallo, along with the New York Ripper. Casting is fantastic. I won't list everyone as I've already have, but I will mention, again, Julia Gemma, as the one police detective who actually solves a crime in an Argento film, and Anthony Franciosa as Peter Neal, a seemingly well-put-together masculine man whose end scene is the stuff of nightmares. Like a book. Like a book.
You know, there's a sentence in a Conan Doyle book. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Mm-hmm. The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yes. You know, the impossible in this case is that the chain of killings doesn't make sense.
Number 1, The Thing. John Carpenter's finest hour. I think everyone knows the history of The Thing, not doing well on its first release, financially and critically. This and Blade Runner didn't stand a chance against the likes of E.T., but over time The Thing has skyrocketed to the top of many favorites list. Carpenter's film is a closer adaptation to the material we already mentioned. A group of 12 researchers, pilots, and mechanics are stationed in Antarctica and encounter an alien life form that begins assimilating them one by one. Paranoia runs rampant as the trust erodes and the fear grows. Featuring one of the best ensemble cast in any horror film. A fantastic score by Morricone. We touch up some Carpenter and Alan Harworth. Great cinematography from Dean Cundy. A great script by Bill Lancaster. And the pinnacle of special effects by a 20-something protege Rob Bottin. Filled with memorable quotes, great scares in the sense of tension and shocks, concepts and scientific theories that leave the viewer thinking, guessing, and theorizing themselves about how and when people were assimilated, and an open ending that I believe sums up Carpenter's mentality perfectly.
What do we do?
Why don't we just wait here for a little while? See what happens.
I will be brief with my worst of list, as I like to treat a deep dive into a year as a celebration instead of a condemnation. With the exclusion of shorts, experimental films, adult films, and compilations, I consider these films to be the top ones to avoid from 1982. I decided to leave out some movies that everyone seems to hate, that I don't love myself, but I feel these movies that I chose offer less. So you won't see Honeymoon Horror, Trick or Treats, Curse of the Screaming Dead, because in one way or another, I can see something worthwhile in them. Number 1, Loch Ness Horror. Dull, boring, sloppy. Even the papier-mâché Nessie can't breathe life into this one. Number 2, Claws. Tedious coming-of-age story that moves slower than molasses. 3, Echoes. Featuring one of the most unwatchable characters of the year, everything Echoes does, another film does better. 4, Ghosts in the Water. British TV at its most dull. Not once does this story do anything more than move at a snail's pace. Number 5, Mazes and Monsters, a weary TV film featuring Tom Hanks as a young man whose schizophrenia is triggered during a game of Dungeons & Dragons. Oh, sorry, Mazes and Monsters, if you will. Feels like an after-school special to warn parents of the horrors of role-playing. A good supporting cast doesn't help this irresponsible propaganda piece. Before we get into the awards, I'd like to put another disclaimer. As I understand, a lot of these could be switched, for example, Best Villain and Best Actor, or Best Kill, Best Special Effects. I choose to do more categories as to showcase more movies and performances. I also want to mention, when we're talking about special effects, I list one person. I am well aware that it takes a team to do special effects, it takes a team to touch up scripts and stuff like that. So if there's one name listed, it's for simplicity. It's not because I think that only one person had their hand in it. Awards. Best Special Effects. The Thing, Rob Bottin. Creepshow, Tom Savini. Best Kill of the Year. Pieces. Locker Room Kill. Waterbed Kill. New York Ripper. Bedroom Kill. Car Kill. Creepshow. I Can Hold My Breath. Tenebrae. Curse of Evil. Turkey Shoot. The Thing. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Friday the 13th, Part 3. The House on Sorority Row, Alone in the Dark. Best Villain and or Monster of the Year.
Halloween.
Dan O'Hara as Connell Cochran in Halloween 3, Season of the Witch.
Samhain. The last great one took place 3,000 years ago, and the hills ran red with the blood of animals and children. Sacrifices are part of our world, our craft. Witchcraft. To us, it was a way of controlling our environment. It's not so different now. It's time again.
John Carradine as Herbert Salter in The Scarecrow.
See how its razor-sharp edge would sink into your lush, virginal body.
Richard Booker as Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th, Part 3. Leslie Nielsen and E.G. Marshall in Creepshow. Jack Palance, Martin Landau, Erwin Van Lith, Alone in the Dark. Timothy Van Patten, Lisa Longolis, Keith Knight, Neil Clifford, Stephen Angram, Class of 1984. Lo Lay, Human Lanterns. Carmen Duncan and Roger Ward, Turkey Shoot. As for monsters, The Night Beast and Night Beast, John Dodds, Christopher Gummer. Basket Case, Belial. The Thing. The Cicada Monster and the Beast Within. Best Cinematography, Dean Cundy, The Thing, and Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Luciano Tovoli, Tenebrae. Best Script, Bill Lancaster, The Thing. Dario Argento, Tenebrae. Best Director, John Carpenter, The Thing. George A. Romero, Creepshow. Dario Argento, Tenebrae. Best Score / Soundtrack, Durfan, Rheingold. Creepshow, John Harrison. The Thing, Ennio Morricone with some additional from John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. Cat People, Giorgio Moroder. Manhattan Baby, Fabio Frizzi. Tenebrae, Claudio Simonetti, Fabio Piccatelli, Massimo Morante. Friday the 13th, Part 3. Harry Manfredini and Michael Zager. Midnight, Quintessence. And Paul McCullough. The New York Ripper, Francisco Damasi. Best Supporting Actor / Actress, Giuliano Gemma, Tenebrae.
Not until I got a telex from Interpol this evening. When Peter Neal was a teenager in Rhode Island, a girl he knew was killed. Brutally. Someone accused him. But there wasn't any real evidence.
John Steiner, Tenebrae.
I was brought up a very strict Catholic. Were you?
Yeah, I guess so.
But I believe in abortion. I believe in divorce. That makes me aberrant from a strictly Catholic standpoint.
I see.
Burt Young, Amityville 2, The Possession. Rutanya Alda, Amityville 2, The Possession.
Oh my God. What's happening to us?
Hal Holbrook, Creep Show. Adrian Barbeau,
What's wrong now?
Creep Show.
Not a thing, Wilma. Everything's just fine.
Stephen King, Creep Show.
Meteor ship.
Best Actress. Azumi Shima, Black Hair, Velvet Soul.
忘れるんだ。僕は何を見ちゃいない。だから忘れるんだ。
Zelda Rubinstein,
I don't know what hovers over
Poltergeist.
this house, but it was strong enough to punch a hole into this world, take your dog away from you. It keeps Carol Ann very close to it and away from the spectral light. It lies to her. It says things.
Gesehen wurde,
Desiree
fuhr er einen
Nosbush,
braunen Rolls-Royce
Der
Corniche
Fan.
und trug einen weißen Leinenanzug. Sachdienliche Hinweise nimmt jede Polizeidienststelle entgegen.
Ich weiß, wo du bist. Keine Angst.
Barbara Hershey, The Entity. Joan Plowright,
in all these months,
Brimstone and Treacle.
I've felt this great stone in my head and on my chest even begin to lift. And all because of that young man out there, whom you so offended with your filth.
Mary Warnoff, Eating
Some
Raoul.
whiskey. Mary, we're both going to end up in prison.
No, we're not. We are going to end up in the country with our own nice little restaurant. None of this ever happened. Now, you take this drink to James, and dinner will be ready in 5 minutes.
Mary, I just killed a man.
He was a man, honey. Now he's just a bag of garbage.
Marina Piero and Francois Blanchard, The Living Dead Girl.
Si tu meurs la première, je te suivrai.
Hélène, je suis ta mort.
Best Actor. Michel Serrault, The Hatter's Ghost.
Non picchiatemi. Telefonate al commissario.
Anthony Franciosa, Tenebrae.
When I realized Cristiano Berti was the killer. And it didn't take me long to realize that. The rest, Mr. Germani, was like writing a book. A book!
They all think you're out.
Delham
right out.
Elliott, Brimstone and Treacle.
All the time you can hear what they're saying.
No, Tom, it's not like that.
All the time you can see the knife in the surgeon's hands. And no matter what they do, however much it hurts, you can't scream.
Sting, Brimstone and Treacle.
I've got him. I've got him.
Paul
Okay,
Bartel,
it comes to
Eating
$19.50.
Raoul.
But I'm telling you, you're gonna need a lubricant for this vibrator. Unless your date's inflatable.
Ha! For your information, I am buying this to use as a novelty cocktail stirrer.
Sure!
Craig T. Nelson,
Son of a
Poltergeist.
bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones!
Tom Atkins, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch.
You've got to, please, stop it. Stop it now. Turn it off. Turn it off.
Best Ensemble Cast. This is rare, but I feel the cast as a whole makes this film work. I will not be doing this every year, but I feel that this film's cast is incredibly special, and I don't think anyone quite matches it. The Thing. Kurt Russell.
Nobody trusts anybody now.
Keith
I just
David.
cannot believe any of this voodoo bullshit.
Wilford Brimley.
That's not dog.
It's imitation.
Donald Moffat.
I'd rather not spend the rest of this winter tied to this fucking couch!
T.K. Carter.
I cut him loose in the lineup by a shack.
Charles Hullahan.
I'm sorry, fellas, but I'm not up to it.
Thomas Waite.
You guys gonna listen to Gary? You gonna let him give the orders? I mean, he could be one of those things!
I don't know
Richard
what the hell's
Nasser.
in there, but it's weird and pissed off, whatever it is.
Richard Dysart.
Let me do it. You're gonna break the needle in my... No, Doc. He's doing a real fine job.
Joe Polis.
But McCready, I've been thinking. If a small particle of this thing is enough to take over an entire organism, then everyone should prepare their own meals. And I suggest we only eat out of cans.
Peter Mahoney.
Knowles, will you turn that crap down? I'm trying to get some sleep. I was shot today.
And David Clennon.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Although not as big as it was in 1981, let's just do another slasher ranking. I've decided to include a few borderline gialli. I feel at this point the giallo genre was adapting a bit to survive. From 1 to 43. Tenebrae, The New York Ripper, Alone in the Dark, Friday 13th Part 3, Pieces, The Slumber Party Massacre, Slayer, Death Valley, The Last Horror Film, Double Exposure, The Black Room, Midnight, House on Sorority Row, The Killing Hour, Wacko, Girls' Night Out, The Dorm That Drip Blood, Visiting Hours, Death Screams, Unhinged, Silent Rage, Tag the Assassination Game, Humongous, Behind the Storm, Superstition, Boarding House, Deadly Games, Hotline, Murder by Phone, Mortuary, The Forest, Blood Song, Till Death Do Us Part, Written in the Fog, Mongrel, Island of Blood, Class Reunion, Ghost Dance, Fantasies, Dark Sanity, Trick or Treats, The Icebox Murders, and Honeymoon Horror at 43. Special thanks. Art Ediger for Basket Case, Pieces, New York Ripper, Q the Winged Serpent, The Amityville 2, The Possession, and the special Top 10 video.
Things that I remember distinctly, and I couldn't tell you the year, but I was flipping channels and Basket Case was on USA Up All Night.
Troy Howarth for Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, Pieces, New York Ripper, Tenebrae, The Thing, and the special Top 10 video.
He ended it the way he ended it, and I think that he, in his naivete, figured, well, that's going to be the end of it. And whereas any producer will tell you, if you really want to kill a vampire, the only way to kill them is to drive a stake through the heart of the producer, because they're going to keep doing it as long as they're making money.
Bruce Holchek for Alone in the Dark, Creepshow, Pieces, New York Ripper, Durfan, Night Beast, and the special Top 10 video.
It credits Bob Shea and somebody named Michael Harpster.
Nathaniel Thompson for Alone in the Dark, Pieces, New York Ripper, The Living Dead Girl, Tenebrae, and the special Top 10 video.
Still, it still kind of hits you in the gut.
Michelle Kisner for Basket Case, Durfan, Q the Winged Serpent, and The Thing.
Remaster of it and changed a little bit of the gameplay and stuff. So if anybody wants to play the Thing game, it's not bad and it's easily available again.
Rob Yabaz for Extro and Amityville 2, The Possession.
We must have just gone to the zoo like that week and seen a panther, and it was like, we need to have one of these in Extro, you know?
Bo Ransdell for Poltergeist.
And this is one of the best uses of it because they are real characters, and the guy who pulls off his face. I like the moment where she's like, "Look, we'll be back tomorrow." He's not coming back.
John and Matt from Sitcom Cinema for Centipede Horror and Calamity of Snakes.
I think we all can agree on that. Because I'm like, there's like, you'd have to cut like whole
sections of the movie out
Yeah.
to get rid of.
Jack Shoulder for Alone in the
Later.
Dark.
He said, "How'd you like to have Jack Palance play, the head guy?" And I said, "Wow, that would be fantastic."
Robert Tinnell for
A couple
Creepshow.
things to understand about George, and I did a series of interviews with him, lectures that are available to students in his program. And he said, I didn't know what I was doing. He goes, so I just shot everything.
Brian Sen for Creepshow.
Gets the edge over Creepshow. That said, I probably have watched Creepshow more than I have the thing.
Ian Urza for Turkey Shoot.
They basically said, imagine if like David Letterman were playing one of these hunters or something like that.
Richard Glenn Smith for Time Walker.
Whoa. I mean, if you can turn that into the miracle that it is, you're a talented pal.
Carly Sonnenfeld for The House on Sorority Row.
Part 7 or something, and it's like, I don't know. So, like, I don't get what he is.
Greg and Pearl Morgan
So
for
it's like,
The
how do
Entity.
you bookend it and say, okay, this is the ending. We get the iceberg, and then we get her coming home, and then we see that she is freaking okay. She's going to deal with it. It is what it is now. I think that's probably why there was that reason why she went to go see her own adaptation of the movie, because I think she wanted to see how they portrayed her, and at the same time too, she was being tormented. How do I say? I'm personally gonna say she was tormented mentally.
Joe Rubin for the adult horror episodes.
With the multiple version distribution model in mind, and this even goes before, long before hardcore was thoughts. There were in the 50s and 60s.
Duncan McLeish for Durfan.
I think it's a blind spot for specifically over here, but it was a blind spot for me, and I'm glad that it isn't now. It's genuinely one of these ones that's made me giddy to finally have seen.
Right.
Yeah, I thought it was really, really, really good.
Lacey Liu for Death Screams.
And it just doesn't work. Like, why would you cast somebody that is in like a hit TV show?
James Earl Edwards for Eating Raoul.
Kind of came back. People wanted to laugh at that point. They were sick of being depressed.
Dave Z and Justin Patrick for Friday the 13th Part
this
3.
was supposed to be the end. But if they would have went with Jenny in the asylum, we wouldn't have got Hockey Mask Jason, most likely.
No way.
Right. And that's probably why, just because of the hockey mask in this movie, that's probably why they continue to make them. It helped me.
Mood 616 for Superstition.
They know, like, this guy's been around for a long time, and he knows the full history of this house. He's like, every time we put someone in this house, they end up dead, like the whole family. And I'm like, what do you think is going to change this time around? Like, it's such a funny thing that everybody knows what's going on in this house, and nothing's ever changed. But they put this family in there anyway.
Dave Becker and Dave Garrett Jr. for Next
all
of
these
Kin.
different things, and then they start to happen again, and I'm kind of like, well, why is this happening? And
the fact, because you get to see her turn around too. I think the whole original idea was that the camera was going to spin around and catch the explosion.
John Kinhart, Chris LaMartina, Jamie Zamarel, and Richard Guyewitz for Night Beast.
Yeah, there were a few of them. And again, in this level of filmmaking, as you just get in there and boom, 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 you shoot the scenes and go.
So let's reverse engineer budgets based off how much TV is picking up stuff for. So I was curious if the $40,000 budget was based off of something like, okay, we'll make it for 40 and then we can sell it for 60.
So if you want to know the behind the scenes story of Count Val and Dick Dizelle, then Every Other Day It's Halloween. I think that might even came out on Blu-ray a year.
That's the university. Yeah, that's where I met Don. Was at in college, and we hung out together a little bit. Of course, he was into monsters and horror and all that stuff, and I was into not necessarily all the monster films and everything, but I loved, like I said, I loved famous monsters.
Dedications. For anyone that was mentioned in previous years, they will not be mentioned for future ones. Toby Hooper, Wes Craven, Richard Jekyll, Cameron Mitchell, Steve Barquette, Jack Taylor, Keith Knight, Christopher George, Larry Cohen, James Karen, Heather O'Rourke, Jose Larraz, Jean Roland, Anthony Franciosa, Giuliano Gemma, Daria Nicolodi, John Steiner, Leslie Nielsen, Alexander Fushang, Kent Chang, Paul Bartel, Lo Lei, Don Doler, Kwei Chi Hung, and George A. Romero. 1982 was a fairly strong year. overall filled with premonitions, reincarnations, pseudoscience, slashers, a few monster assaults, marital horror, and other familiarities of the genre. The rise of the science fiction horror continued, while there was a noticeable decline in nihilism in cinema. A lot of that carryover from the 70s was waning. Hammer Studios was already gone. By 1985, Shaw Brothers' horror output would be nearly zero. Roger Corman would sell New World Pictures in 1983, although it continued in a new direction. Soon Stephen King would be king. Slasher films were fully realized and were already seemingly dying, but just around the horizon was a fedora-wearing dream demon to breathe new life into the genre within a couple years. But not before 1983. Evil took new shapes in cars and warped television signals. Horror's trajectory is and was forever changing and evolving, from mean to silly, to grounded to absurd, from sober to cocaine-fueled binges. For the curious viewer, here's every film watched for 1982, in order. Note, some titles' dates changed during the process. They are included.
It's just an act. Flaunting a little body at me.
What do you mean?
Man, you know, rubbing up against me whenever she gets an excuse.
All the people surrounding you don't want to be your friend. All the hope keeping you has fun.
We would have never known Mrs. Slater's still alive.
How do we know she is alive?
What do you think? She floated out that pool? Or maybe she got sucked down the drain?
They didn't even get the bird. They got the egg. If they'd have done what I told them to do, put the canvas over the top.
Oh, just call me Billy. Everyone does. You need someone to show you the ropes, hon. You just come see me. Not too slow.
Have you heard the latest? They've just installed a waterbed in the training room.
Have you ever been laid on a waterbed? The most beautiful thing in the world is smoking pot and fucking on a waterbed at the same time. Don't let go.
Hey, are you okay up there?
All right, you're gonna need some lubricant for this vibrator. We've got KY and Lay Orgy Gel. Hey, you taste it, you're gonna buy it, all right? The Lay Orgy Gel comes in lemon, mint, cherry, or trail mix. Trail mix? That's making a joke.
I do love a good joke, and this is the best ever. The joke of the children.
Don't let go. Mean it. Not too slow.
Speaking. What do you want?
To dedicate a killing to you.
Now, Chuck Norris must destroy him.
Child, chariots of the gods, man. They practically own South America. I mean, they taught the Incas everything they know.
Make me know.
What's in the basket?
Don't let go.
I know I'm human. And if you were all these things, then you just attack me right now. So some of you are still human. This thing doesn't want to show itself. It wants to hide inside an imitation. It'll fight if it has to. But it's vulnerable out in the open. If it takes us over, then it has no more enemies. Nobody left to kill it. And then it's won.
Son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones! Why? Why?
For a girl like you to come into my life, I've been waiting for a girl like you, the love that will survive. I've been waiting, someone new to make me feel alive. Yeah, waiting for a girl like you to come into my life.
You bitch! You called me a
What's in the basket?
How do we know she is alive?
Say, please stop it. There's no more time. You've got to. Please stop it. Stop it now. Turn it off. Turn it off. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it.